Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I was only 8 years old when it happened, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. It's burned into my brain. One of those memories that never fades no matter how much time passes. I'm 34 now, but I still get chills thinking about it. Still have nightmares about those eyes watching me from the tree line. It was summer in Louisiana, probably around 1996. One of those sticky hot days where the air feels like soup and your clothes cling to your skin minutes after stepping outside. Our house sat at the edge of this dense patch of woods. Nothing massive, but big enough that my parents always warned us not to wander too deep. Of course, being kids, we ignored that advice constantly. That particular day, I was following my 12-year-old sister and her friend Michelle as they explored. I was always tagging along back then, the annoying little brother they had to babysit. They didn't really want me there, but my mom had made it clear I wasn't to be left alone in the house, so they were stuck with me. The woods behind our house were typical Louisiana forest. Lots of pine trees, some oak, thick underbrush that would tear at your legs if you weren't careful. We'd worn a decent path through our regular play area, though. We had this fort that wasn't really a fort at all, just a fallen tree and some branches we'd propped up to make walls. But to us, it was our secret hideout. We'd been out there for maybe an hour. My sister and Michelle were playing some game they'd made up involving collecting certain types of leaves, and I was digging in the dirt with a stick, looking for bugs or whatever 8-year-old boys find fascinating. It was peaceful, normal. Nothing felt off or strange. That changed in an instant. The first snap of a branch didn't really register. Woods make noise, animals, wind, falling twigs. But then there was another snap, louder, closer, then another. My sister stopped mid-sentence. "Did you guys hear that?" Michelle nodded, suddenly alert. I remember the way her eyes widened, scanning the trees around us. The snapping sounds continued, methodical almost. Not like a squirrel or raccoon moving through underbrush. These were heavy, deliberate. The sound of something large moving through the woods. "Let's head back," my sister said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in her voice. Even at 8, I knew she was scared. We started walking toward home, not running yet, but moving with purpose. The sounds followed us, paralleling our path, but staying just out of sight among the denser trees. Whatever it was big enough to make branches snap under its weight, and it was matching our pace. My sister grabbed my hand, something she never did voluntarily. Michelle walked on my other side, and I remember how rigid her posture was, how she kept looking over her shoulder. We were maybe a quarter mile from our backyard, following the worn path that led home. The thing is, the sounds never rushed us. It never charged or made any aggressive move. It just followed, pacing us, watching us. At one point, the snapping stopped for maybe 30 seconds, and that was almost worse, not knowing where it was. Then we heard it again, now ahead of us somehow. My sister actually stopped walking. "What is that?" Michelle whispered. I remember my sister shushing her, then tugging my hand harder as we picked up our pace. We were practically jogging now, no longer pretending we weren't scared. When we finally broke through the tree line into our backyard, I felt this massive wave of relief. Our house was right there, safety just yards away. We slowed down, catching our breath. I remember thinking it was over. Whatever it was had stayed in the woods. That's when I saw it. It was standing between 2 large pine trees at the edge of the woods, partially hidden but clearly visible. At first, my brain tried to make it into something normal, a shadow, a dead tree, something that made sense. But it wasn't any of those things. It was tall, really tall. Even from 200 yards or so away, I could tell it towered over the surrounding vegetation. Its body was completely black, not brown or dark grey, but a deep, absorbing black that seemed to stand out even against the shadowy forest behind it. The shoulders were impossibly wide, and its arms hung down far lower than any human's would, almost to its knees. But it was the head that made my blood run cold. It wasn't round like a person's. It came to this slight point or dome at the top, giving it this alien wrong silhouette against the trees. And the eyes, they were set deep in its face, dark hollows that somehow caught what little light there was. I couldn't make out details from that distance, but I could feel them fixed on us, watching, studying. I tugged at my sister's sleeve. "Do you see that?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. She was already staring at it, frozen in place. Michelle saw it too. I could tell by the way her breathing changed, becoming shallow and quick. "Don't move," my sister whispered. "Just don't move." So we stood there, 3 kids in a backyard, having a staring contest with something that shouldn't exist. It didn't move either, didn't make a sound, didn't come closer or retreat deeper into the woods. It just stood there, watching us with those dark, sunken eyes. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Probably only a minute or 2, though it felt like hours. Eventually, my sister gripped my shoulder and started slowly backing us toward the house. "Don't run," she kept whispering. "Don't run." We backed away, step by step, not taking our eyes off it until we reached the back door. My sister fumbled with the handle, pushed me inside first, then she and Michelle followed, slamming and locking the door behind us. Inside, we all started talking at once. "Did you see it?" "What was that thing?" "It was watching us." My mom was in the kitchen and came in to see what the commotion was about. When we tried to explain, she looked concerned but not convinced. She went to the window and looked out at the tree line. But by then, whatever it was had gone, or at least it wasn't visible anymore. "Probably just a black bear," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. Black bears aren't that common in our part of Louisiana, and they don't stand upright between trees watching children for minutes at a time. My sister argued it wasn't a bear. It was standing on 2 legs the whole time, was way too tall, had a weird-shaped head. Mom just kept saying we had active imaginations and had scared ourselves, but I knew what I saw. We all did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes in my mind, feeling that awful sensation of being watched, being hunted. Every noise outside my window made me freeze under my covers. I ended up sleeping in my sister's room, something I hadn't done since I was 5. The weird thing is, we never saw it again. We were too scared to go back into the woods for weeks, and when we finally did, we stayed close to the yard and went as a group. But whatever had watched us that day never returned, at least not where we could see it. Years passed. I grew up. The incident became one of those childhood memories you start to question. Was it really that tall? Were its arms really that long? Was it just a weirdly shaped tree, and our imaginations filled in the rest? Then, when I was in high school, I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film for the first time in science class. We were discussing cryptozoology and the scientific method, using Bigfoot as an example. The moment that grainy footage played, showing that creature walking across the creek bed, turning to look at the camera, I felt like someone had dumped ice water down my back. The shape, the proportions, the way it moved. It was the same basic silhouette as what we'd seen that day in the woods. The dome-shaped head, the wide shoulders, the long arms. I remember sitting there in class, unable to breathe properly, while everyone else was laughing about how fake it looked. But I wasn't laughing. All I could think was, that's it. That's what was watching us. I talked to my sister about it that night. She's 4 years older, was away at college by then, but I called her immediately. As soon as I mentioned the Patterson film, there was this long silence on the phone. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she finally said. "The similarity." We talked for hours that night, comparing our memories, realizing we both remembered the same details, details we hadn't discussed in years. The shape of the head, the impossibly wide shoulders, the way it stood so still, just observing us. Michelle moved away when we were still in middle school, but my sister stayed in touch with her. Apparently, Michelle refused to talk about that day at all, just changed the subject whenever it came up. I'm an adult now with a logical, scientific mind. I work in IT, deal with concrete problems and solutions. I should have outgrown this memory or rationalized it away, but I haven't. I still dream about it sometimes, standing in that backyard, feeling those eyes on me. In the dreams, sometimes it steps out of the tree line and comes toward me. I always wake up before it reaches me, heart pounding, covered in sweat. I've read about Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what we saw. Some stories match ours. The height, the watching behavior, the way it paralleled our path. But nothing quite captures the feeling of being studied by something that intelligent, but clearly not human. What bothers me most, even now, is the purpose behind it all. It never threatened us, never charged or made aggressive moves. It just watched. Like we were the curiosity, not it, like it was learning about us. I don't go back to my parents' house much anymore. They still live in the same place. When I do visit, I avoid looking at those woods, especially at dusk. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the tree line anyway, half expecting to see that dark shape standing between the pines, those deep-set eyes finding mine across the yard. Whatever it was, I know it was real. Not a bear, not a person in a suit, not a trick of light or shadow, something else. Something that doesn't quite fit into the world as we understand it. And sometimes, on dark nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it remembers us too. If somewhere out in those Louisiana woods, it occasionally thinks about the 3 children it once watched and what it learned about us that day. Story 2. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my family. Even after all these years, I still get this weird feeling in my gut when I think about what happened that night. I was 17 back then, just a kid trying to make some money working the late shift at the gas station in Sydney. It was the winter of 1979, going into 1980, one of those brutal Montana winters where the temperature drops so low, your lungs hurt when you breathe. That particular night was especially nasty. The thermometer outside the station had read 15 below zero when I clocked out around 11. My boss had offered to let me crash on his couch since the roads were getting slick, but I was stubborn. I wanted to get home to my own bed, and it was only about 20 miles down Highway 200. I'd driven it hundreds of times before. The parking lot was covered with this thin layer of snow that crunched under my boots. I remember warming up my old Chevy for a good 10 minutes before even attempting to drive. The heater barely worked, so I had on pretty much every layer I owned: thermal underwear, jeans, a flannel shirt, my heaviest sweater, and this bulky winter coat my grandma had given me for Christmas. I even had these ridiculous wool socks pulled up over my jeans and 2 pairs of gloves. Still wasn't enough. My fingers were stiff on the steering wheel the whole drive. Highway 200 was completely deserted. No surprise there. Nobody with any sense would be out in that weather at that hour. The snow wasn't falling heavily, but it was drifting across the highway in these ghostly waves, making everything look hazy under my headlights. I was driving slower than usual, maybe 40 miles per hour, because the road was treacherous. One patch of black ice, and I'd be in the ditch, and nobody would come by until morning. I remember I was listening to some cassette. I think it was Zeppelin, and fighting to stay alert. Working those late shifts always drained me, and the monotony of that empty highway wasn't helping. The road between Sydney and my home in Fairview has these rolling hills. Nothing major, just gentle dips and rises. I was approaching this one section, about 15 miles outside of town, where the road dips between 2 small hills. There were guardrails on both sides, because there's a pretty steep drop-off on one side and a sharp incline on the other. As I started down into that dip, my headlights swept across the road ahead, and I saw something. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A deer? No, way too big. A moose? No, the shape was all wrong. It was stepping out from the end of the guardrail on the right side of the road, moving in this calm, deliberate way across the highway toward the left side. It was walking upright, like a man, but not a man, not even close. I instinctively eased off the gas, but I didn't hit the brakes hard. The road was too slick for that. The car slowed gradually as this thing continued crossing the highway. It never sped up, never acted startled, just kept this steady pace like it didn't have a care in the world, like my approaching car meant nothing to it. As I got closer, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, I could make out more details, and that's when the first real wave of fear hit me. It was huge, easily over 6 feet tall, maybe closer to 7, but it wasn't just tall, it was massive. Broad shoulders, thick limbs, powerful looking, not fat, but solid. Muscular, the proportions were all wrong for a human, and it was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, but hair that moved in the wind. I could see it clearly in my headlights. This medium brown color at the roots that got lighter toward the tips. Almost like it was frosted. The hair wasn't super long or matted like I'd seen in those cheesy tabloid photos. This was different. More natural looking, I guess. I'd seen that Patterson-Gimlin film they sometimes showed on those Unexplained Mysteries TV specials. What I was seeing looked similar to that, but somehow more real, more substantial. This wasn't some guy in a costume. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. It crossed the highway with these straight, confident steps, not stiff or awkward at all. Its arms swung slightly at its sides, just like yours or mine would if you were taking a casual walk. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was in profile to me, but I could make out what looked like a pronounced brow ridge and no visible neck. Its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. By this point, I'd slowed to maybe 20 miles per hour, and I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white inside my gloves. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I had this metallic taste in my mouth. Pure fear. I'd never felt anything like it before or since. The creature reached the other side of the road just as I was approaching the spot where it had crossed. It disappeared behind the guardrail on the left side, heading down toward a creek bed that runs through that area. I remember having this crazy impulse to stop the car, to get out and look for it or follow it somehow. But there was no way, absolutely no way, I was getting out of that car. Instead, I hit the gas, harder than I should have on that slick road, and felt the back end fishtail a little before the tires caught. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it coming after me or something, but the road behind me was empty. Just snow drifting across the asphalt in my taillights. The rest of the drive home is a blur. I don't remember anything except the blood pounding in my ears and checking my mirrors every few seconds. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I just sat there for a while, engine running, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Eventually, I went inside. My parents were already asleep, but my older brother was still up watching TV. He took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, or worse, I told him, right there in our kitchen, my voice shaking the whole time. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was crazy or hallucinating from exhaustion. But he didn't. He just listened. And when I was done, he asked a bunch of questions. How tall was it exactly? What color was the hair? Did it make any noise? Did it look at me? I answered as best I could, but it was all so surreal, like trying to describe a nightmare while you're still half asleep. The next morning I woke up late. My dad had already left for work, but my mom and brother were in the kitchen. My brother had told my mom, and she was concerned, not about what I'd seen, but about me driving in those conditions. She thought I must have been overtired and seen a bear or something. A part of me wanted to go back to that spot. to look for tracks in the snow, to prove to myself and everyone else that I hadn't imagined it. But another bigger part of me was terrified of going back there. What if it was still around? What if there were more of them? I kept thinking about how casual it had been, how unconcerned with my approach, like it owned that stretch of highway and I was just passing through its territory. I never did go back to check for tracks. By the time I worked up the courage a couple days later, there had been more snow, and any evidence would have been long gone. I've regretted that for 40 years now. I drove that stretch of road hundreds more times after that night. You can't avoid it living where I did, but I never saw anything like that again. Every time I passed that spot, though, especially at night, I'd feel my grip tighten on the steering wheel and my eyes would scan the trees and the guardrails. A few years later, I read an article in the local paper about strange tracks found by hunters in that same general area. The article treated it as a curiosity, a prank probably. But I knew better. I've seen all those Bigfoot shows on TV, heard all the theories and jokes. Most of the supposed evidence seems like garbage to me. Blurry photos, casts of footprints that could have been faked, second-hand stories that grow with each telling, but none of that changes what I saw that night. I don't know what it was. I don't know if Bigfoot or Sasquatch is the right name for it. What I do know is that something not human, something intelligent and powerful, crossed Highway 200 in front of me on that frigid Montana night. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was as real as the ice on the road or the steering wheel under my hands. It's been over 40 years now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Almost. But then I remember the absolute certainty I felt in that moment, the recognition that I was seeing something my brain couldn't fully process, something outside the normal world. I still drive through Montana sometimes, visiting family. And every time I pass a stretch of dark highway with guardrails and trees beyond, I find myself slowing down just a little, eyes scanning the roadside, wondering if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I never do. Part of me is still looking. Story 3. I still can't believe what happened that night. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and it still doesn't make any sense. This happened about 3 months ago when I was working the graveyard shift at Randy's Donuts off Highway 115 through Florence, Colorado. It's one of those jobs where nothing ever happens. You make donuts all night, serve the occasional trucker or insomniac, and count the minutes until your shift ends. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 8 p.m., relieving Marcy, who always complained about how dead the place was. If only she knew what dead would really feel like later that night. The shop sits in this little commercial strip with a car wash next door and some storage units behind us. Across the street there's that old abandoned warehouse that used to be a feed store or something. Around 2:45 in the morning, I was doing prep work for the morning rush, getting the fryers ready, when I first noticed something was off. The neighborhood dogs started going crazy. Now we occasionally get coyotes coming down from the wet mountains to rummage through dumpsters, and the local dogs always let everyone know. But this was different. It wasn't just barking, it was this frantic, terrified sound, like they were warning about something they were genuinely scared of. I remember checking the clock and thinking, just an hour and 15 minutes until Kevin shows up for the morning shift. That's how mundane my thoughts were at that moment. I had no idea what was coming. My co-worker Tom was out front wiping down tables. We usually had 2 people on graveyard, one for baking, one for the counter. Most nights we'd barely see 5 customers between midnight and 5 a.m. That's how quiet Florence gets. About 20 or 25 minutes after the dog started freaking out, Tom called me from the front. "Hey, you gotta come see this," he said. I remember being annoyed because I was elbow deep in dough and didn't want to mess up my timing. "What is it?" I yelled back. "Just come here, now." There was something in his voice that made me stop what I was doing. I wiped my hands and headed to the front. Tom was standing at the big plate glass window that faces the highway, completely still. When I got next to him, he just pointed. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. At first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed movement under one of the streetlights about 100 yards down the road. Something big. Something walking. "Is that a person in a costume?" I asked, because my brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "No way," Tom said. "Look at the size of it." As it moved further into the cone of light from the street lamp, I could see it clearly. It was massive, absolutely massive, walking upright on two legs, but it wasn't human, not even close. It was covered from head to toe in long, shaggy, reddish-brown hair. The streetlight gave it this weird copper glow. The thing that really got me was its proportions. Its shoulders were enormous, wide and hunched, and its head, it didn't seem to have a neck at all. The head just sat directly on those shoulders, like it was part of them. I don't know what possessed me, but I moved toward the door. "What are you doing?" Tom hissed, grabbing my arm. "I don't know," I said, and it was true. I had this weird compulsion to get a better look, like I needed to confirm I wasn't hallucinating. I pushed the door open. The bell jingled. That stupid, cheerful bell that suddenly sounded obscene in the quiet night. "Hey!" I called out, not screaming, just loud enough to carry across the empty parking lot. The thing stopped. It turned its head, just its head, toward me. I couldn't make out a face in all that hair, but I knew it was looking straight at me. I felt it, like someone had dropped an ice cube down my back. It didn't run away. It didn't charge at me. It just looked. For maybe 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then it simply turned away and continued walking alongside this chain-link fence that runs past the car wash and storage units. That fence is topped with barbed wire and stands about 6 or 7 feet tall. This thing's shoulders were roughly level with the top of it. Let that sink in. Its shoulders were at the same height as a 7-foot fence. I stood there in the doorway, unable to move, as it continued walking. Its gait was smooth, not lumbering like you'd expect from something so big, almost graceful in a terrifying way. It disappeared from view behind the storage units, heading towards Sand Creek drainage. Tom pulled me back inside and locked the door. "What the fuck was that?" he kept saying over and over. What the actual fuck was that? I couldn't answer him. My throat felt like I'd swallowed sand. We just stared at each other, both trying to process what we'd seen. About 10 minutes later, I know the timing because I kept obsessively checking the clock on the wall. Our paper delivery guy, Mike, showed up in his pickup. He comes every night around 3:30 to drop off the morning newspapers. When he came in, his face was pale. "You guys okay?" he asked, looking between us. Tom and I exchanged glances. "Why wouldn't we be?" I asked. I heard something when I was parking. Coming from that old building across the street, something big moving around in there. Made this weird sound like..." He struggled to find the words. Not a growl, not a howl. Something in between. Scared the hell out of me. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. That abandoned building was in the direction the creature had been heading. "Did you see anything?" I asked Mike. "Nah, just heard it, but it was enough to make me run to my truck. Nearly dropped all your papers." He laughed nervously. Probably just a homeless guy or something, right? Neither Tom nor I answered that. After Mike left, we debated calling the police. What would we even say? "Hello, officer, we just saw Bigfoot strolling down Highway 115, but in the end, we didn't have to make that call." At around 4:15, a police cruiser pulled into the lot. Officer Ramirez was a regular, always stopped by for coffee and donuts toward the end of his shift. I'd never been so happy to see a cop in my life. As soon as he walked in, he must have noticed something was wrong. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," he said, only half joking. Tom blurted it all out before I could stop him. To his credit, Officer Ramirez didn't laugh or dismiss us. He listened carefully, asked a few questions about direction and timing, then he asked if we were sure it wasn't a bear. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs for that long," I said. And they don't have shoulders like a linebacker. He nodded slowly. I'll take a look around. Maybe check out behind those storage units. You said it was heading towards Sand Creek. We both nodded. Lock the door behind me. I'll be back in a few minutes. He was gone for about 15 minutes. When he returned, he was different. His face had this tight look, and his hand was resting on his holster. When he reached for the coffee I poured him, his hand was trembling so badly he spilled some on the counter. Did you see it? Tom asked eagerly. Officer Ramirez shook his head. No, didn't see anything. But the way he said it made my stomach knot up. He was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. What did you see out there? I pressed. He took a long sip of coffee before answering. Nothing specific, just tracks. Not sure what made them. He looked directly at me. You're sure it wasn't a bear, right? Sometimes they can look different in the dark. I shook my head. It wasn't a bear. He nodded slowly, like he was afraid I'd say that. Well, I radioed it in. Told them there was a possible wildlife sighting. He emphasized wildlife in a weird way. They'll probably send someone from Fish and Wildlife tomorrow. But the way his eyes kept darting to the window told me he wasn't convinced this was a job for Fish and Wildlife. The rest of our shift was tense. Every noise made us jump. When Kevin finally showed up at 5 a.m. to start the morning shift, I've never been so relieved to see another human being. I didn't tell Kevin what happened. How could I? But Officer Ramirez pulled me aside as I was leaving. Listen, he said quietly. Maybe keep this between us for now, all right? No need to cause a panic. What did you really see out there? I asked him. He hesitated. I'm not sure, but whatever it was. He stopped and looked around, then lowered his voice even more. Whatever it was, it's not something I've encountered before, and I grew up hunting in these mountains. I drove home as the sun was coming up, watching the wet mountains turn purple, then pink in the morning light. Just a few miles to the south, they looked so peaceful, so normal, but I kept thinking about how close they were to town, how easy it would be for something to come down from those remote areas, following Sand Creek or the Arkansas River right into Florence. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. Then I switched to day shift. I told my manager I couldn't handle the late hours anymore. The truth is, I can't stand being near that shop after dark. Sometimes I still have to drive past it on Highway 115 at night, and every time I catch myself scanning the shadows, looking for movement. I never saw whatever it was again. No one did, as far as I know. The police never followed up. Fish and Wildlife never showed up. It's like it never happened. Except it did. And every time I hear a dog barking frantically in the middle of the night, I wonder if it's come back, walking silently through town on those impossibly long legs, its head sitting directly on those massive shoulders, watching us through the windows of our homes. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't human, and I know it's still out there somewhere. Story 4. I still can't make sense of what happened that day. I've been an avid hunter since I was a kid, spent thousands of hours in the woods, and never once felt unsafe until fall of 2008. I took my nephew deer hunting in Northern California, a spot near Sims where cattle used to graze before the area was abandoned and turned back to wilderness. It's normally a decent place for deer. Not too many hunters know about it, and the old grazing paths make for good travel corridors for wildlife. My nephew was 15 at the time and had been hunting with me a handful of times before. He was getting pretty good, so I figured I'd set him up in his own stand while I took one about a quarter-mile away. That way, we could cover more ground, but still be close enough if he needed anything. The morning started out normal. We got to our spot before sunrise, temperature in the low 40s, slight breeze coming from the west. I remember checking the wind direction carefully because I didn't want our scent blowing toward the area where I expected deer to come from. I helped my nephew get settled in his tree stand, made sure his safety harness was secured properly, and headed off to my own spot. The forest was quiet that morning. Just the usual sounds. Birds waking up, leaves rustling in the breeze. I was walking along a game trail when I first heard it. A low moaning sound coming from a thick patch of brush about 50 yards to my right. My first thought was that my nephew had left his stand for some reason and gotten hurt. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, not too loud, but enough to be heard nearby. No answer. Instead, I heard splashing, like something moving through water. There's a small creek that runs through that part of the woods, but it forms these stagnant pools in some areas. The splashing wasn't like a deer walking through water. It was heavier, deliberate. I moved closer, thinking maybe a deer was wounded or stuck. I've helped injured animals before, and while it's not always safe, I couldn't just leave something suffering. As I approached, this smell hit me. I've smelled a lot of nasty things in my life, gut piles, dead animals that have been rotting for days in the summer heat. But this was different. This was wrong. It's hard to describe that smell. Like something had died, then been soaked in sewage, then set on fire. It was so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. I've field-dressed hundreds of animals and never reacted like that to a smell. I was about 20 yards from the thicket when I saw it. Even now, 14 years later, I get goosebumps thinking about what came out of those bushes. This thing was moving through the brush at a pace that seemed impossible for something its size. It was massive, had to be 6, maybe 7 feet tall, and it was on 2 legs, covered in dark, thick hair, about 3 inches long, matted in some places, not fur like a bear, more like hair. I froze, completely froze. I had my rifle, but I couldn't even think to raise it. The creature was walking upright, but with this slight stoop, like its upper body was too heavy. The head was rounded, but had this subtle point at the top. I couldn't see its face clearly through the brush, and honestly, I'm grateful for that. The build on this thing, it wasn't just big, it was powerful. The shoulders were massive, the arms longer than they should be. It moved with this strange confidence, like it knew exactly where it was going and nothing could stop it. It wasn't rushing, but it covered ground fast. The way it navigated through knee-deep, sludgy water without slowing down was unnatural. That smell seemed to be coming from it. The closer it got to me, the stronger the smell became. I've been around wild animals all my life, and they have their scents, but nothing like this. This was aggressive, almost like the smell itself was a warning. I only saw it for maybe 30 seconds as it moved through that water and into the trees on the other side. It never looked at me, never acknowledged me, just moved through with purpose. The brush was thick enough that I never got a completely clear view. Just pieces, the arm, the back, the profile of that strange head. When it was gone, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. My hands were shaking. In all my years hunting, I've never had that reaction to anything. Not bears, not mountain lions, nothing. I didn't follow it. Everything in me was screaming to get back to my nephew. I took a different route, circling wide around that thicket. I kept my rifle ready the whole time, scanning constantly, jumping at every sound. The smell lingered in that area, but got weaker as I moved away. When I reached my nephew, he was still in his stand, looking pale. Before I could say anything, he asked, "Did you smell that?" I just nodded, not wanting to freak him out more. "I heard something too," he said, "like grunting in the trees. Not a deer. It made me feel sick." We packed up and left, didn't even talk much on the drive home. What could I say? That I saw Bigfoot? That sounds crazy even now as I type this. But I know what I saw wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. It wasn't a person in a suit. No one could fake that movement, that power, especially not through deep mud. And that smell, you can't fake that. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of deformed bear with mange. Maybe it was some unknown animal. But deep down, I know better. Whatever I saw that day doesn't fit into the world as I understand it. We never went back to that spot. My nephew didn't ask to go hunting again for almost 2 years. When we finally did start hunting together again, we stayed in open areas, places with visibility. Neither of us ever mentioned what happened that day near Sims, but I know he sensed something too. The part that still haunts me is how deliberate it all felt. This wasn't some animal randomly wandering through the woods. It moved like it had a destination, a purpose, and the fact that it didn't seem bothered by me at all, didn't run, didn't threaten, just continued on its way, that suggests something that has no natural predators, nothing to fear. I've spent my whole life in those woods. I thought I knew every animal, every sound, every smell, but that day showed me there are things out there we don't understand, things that move through the wilderness like they own it, while we're just visitors who don't know the rules. Sometimes when I'm in the woods now, I catch myself listening for that splashing sound, or God forbid, that smell. I've never experienced anything like it again, but I find myself scanning the tree line more carefully, especially in dense areas. I don't tell people about this much. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw. For months after, I had trouble sleeping. I kept seeing that silhouette moving through the trees in my dreams, the strange stoop of its shoulders, the way its arms hung too long at its sides. I'd wake up thinking I could smell that horrific odor in my bedroom. My wife thought I was losing it. Maybe I was. I've read accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar things. Some match my experience pretty closely. The height, the hair, the smell. That makes it both better and worse somehow. Better because I'm not crazy. Worse because it means these things are really out there. The scientific part of my brain still tries to explain it away. Northern California has some remote areas where who knows what could live undisturbed. Maybe it was some unknown primate. Maybe it was something else entirely. But here's the thing that really gets me. Whatever it was, it seemed at home there. Like it belonged in those woods more than I did. Like it knew its way around better than any human could. That feeling of being the outsider, of being in something else's territory. That's what I can't shake. My nephew and I have never really talked about it. The closest we came was about a year later, when he asked if I remembered that weird day near Sims. I just nodded and he said, "I'm glad we left when we did." That was it. But I could see in his eyes that whatever he sensed or heard that day had stuck with him too. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods. I'm not going to let one unexplainable experience ruin something I love. But I'm more cautious now, more aware that there are things out there we don't understand and maybe aren't meant to. That day changed how I see the wilderness. It's not just a place for recreation or hunting anymore. It's a place where ancient things might still move through the shadows. Things that have been there long before us and will be there long after. Things that don't care about our presence one way or another. I don't have any physical evidence, no footprints, no photos, nothing. Just what I saw with my own eyes and what I smelled with my own nose. And that's the frustrating part. Knowing something life-changing happened, but having no way to prove it to anyone else. So I carry it with me, this 30-second encounter that changed how I see the world. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, moving through those abandoned grazing lands, going about whatever business such creatures have. I wonder if others have seen it too, but, like me, keep quiet for fear of sounding crazy. All I know for sure is what I saw that fall day in 2008, and that's enough to make me certain that our understanding of what lives in those woods is far from complete. Story 5. I still remember every single detail of that day in the woods near Wenatchee, and no matter how many times I try to rationalize what I saw, I can't shake the feeling that I encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist. This happened back in '97. I'd been hunting in the Washington forest my whole life, grew up right outside Aberdeen, where the trees are so thick and the air is always heavy with moisture. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. It was early fall, late October if I remember right. The leaves had already dropped from most of the trees, covering the ground in this soggy brown carpet. We'd had rain for about a week straight before that day, making everything slick and muddy, classic Pacific Northwest weather. I headed out that afternoon toward Wenatchee. The skies were overcast, threatening more rain, but I didn't care. Sometimes you just need to get away from everything, you know? I had my trusty 30-30 with me, the same rifle my dad had given me when I turned 16. Technically, I was deer hunting, but honestly, I was mostly just looking to be alone with my thoughts. I drove down these winding back roads until I found a spot that looked promising. A partially regrown, clear-cut area that sloped up from the road. Perfect hunting territory, since deer often browse in these transition areas between dense forest and open spaces. I pulled over, grabbed my rifle and day pack, and started hiking up the hill. The ground was super slippery from all the rain, and I had to grab onto young saplings a few times to keep from sliding back down. My boots were caked with mud within minutes. I made my way about 200 yards up into the clear cut and found a decent spot to sit among the stumps and new growth. There were these huge, old-growth stumps scattered around, remnants from logging operations, probably 20 years earlier, with smaller trees and thick brush growing up between them. I settled in against one of the bigger stumps that gave me a good view down the slope and across to the mature forest edge. The stump was still solid but covered in moss that soaked through my jacket almost immediately. I remember thinking I should have brought one of those waterproof seat pads. It was around 5 in the afternoon. The light was already starting to fade under those heavy clouds, creating that weird grey-blue twilight that happens in the forest. Not quite dark, but definitely not full daylight either. I figured I had maybe another hour of decent visibility before I'd need to head back to the truck. I'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes, just listening to the occasional drip of water from the trees and watching a couple of Stella jays arguing in a nearby hemlock when I heard it. Movement in the brush below me, down toward the edge of the mature forest. My first thought was, finally, a deer. So I immediately went still and crouched a bit lower behind the stump. The sound wasn't quite right, though. Deer make this distinctive walking pattern, delicate steps with occasional pauses. This was different, heavier, more deliberate. I actually remember thinking it might be another hunter, but I hadn't seen any other vehicles parked nearby. I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line about 60 yards downslope. The brush moved, and I expected to see the brown shape of a deer emerge. What stepped out instead? Man, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. This figure just appeared from between 2 big Douglas firs. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was standing completely upright, walking on 2 legs, but it definitely wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung much longer than a person's would, almost to its knees. The shoulders were massive, broader than any linebacker I've ever seen. And there was this strange, rounded head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with no visible neck. The entire body was covered in dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like long hair that moved slightly in the breeze. Even from 60 yards away, I could tell this thing was huge. I'm 6 foot even, and this creature had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The body was thick and powerful looking, with a barrel chest and what looked like powerful legs. I remember my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth went completely dry. I had my rifle right there beside me, but I never even thought about raising it. Not once. There was something about this creature that didn't feel threatening. Not directly, anyway. It felt... I don't know how else to describe it except to say it felt ancient and powerful and like it absolutely belonged there. I was the intruder, not it. The creature paused at the edge of the trees and turned its head, looking directly up the slope, looking right at where I was crouched. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance, but I could swear I saw eyes reflecting some of the fading light. dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow ridge. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, we just stared at each other. I didn't move a muscle. I barely breathed. I had this overwhelming sense that if I made any sudden movement, things could go very badly for me. Not because the creature seemed aggressive, but because it was so obviously powerful. Then, without any sound I could detect, it turned and began moving along the base of the slope, parallel to the tree line. The way it moved was incredible. It wasn't running, but its stride was so long and smooth that it covered ground faster than I could run. It stepped over fallen logs and brush that would have slowed me down considerably, barely breaking its pace. There was this fluid, natural grace to its movement that seemed impossible for something so large. I watched as it moved about 100 yards along the edge of the forest before disappearing back into the trees. The whole encounter probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but it's burned into my memory like it was hours. When it was finally gone, I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. Not just my hands, but my entire body. My legs felt like jelly. I stayed frozen in place for at least 5 more minutes, afraid to move, afraid it might come back. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. Just absolute stillness. When I finally stood up, my knees nearly buckled. I had to grab onto a nearby sapling to steady myself. I kept my eyes fixed on that spot where the creature had disappeared, half expecting it to emerge again. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to go down there and look for tracks or other evidence, but there was no way in hell I was going closer to where that thing went. The more rational part of my brain was already trying to explain away what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. But I'd seen plenty of bears in my life, and this was nothing like a bear. The proportions were all wrong, the movement completely different. Bears lumber when they walk upright. This thing strode. The light was fading fast now, and the thought of being in those woods after dark suddenly seemed like the worst idea possible. I picked up my rifle, which now felt ridiculously inadequate, and began making my way back down to the road. I moved as quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder and stopping to listen every few steps. The walk back to my truck seemed to take forever. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept feeling like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from the dark spaces between the trees. By the time I reached my truck, I was practically jogging. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in the cab, and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute with the engine running, headlights illuminating the empty road and the wall of trees beyond. My hands were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation, but coming up empty. The drive home was a blur. I remember stopping at a gas station about 20 miles away and catching my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked pale as a ghost. The guy behind the counter asked if I was feeling okay, and I just nodded and paid for my coffee. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Not my wife, not my hunting buddies, nobody. Who would believe me? Hell, I was having trouble believing it myself, and I was the one who saw it. I've spent decades in those forests, hunting, fishing, hiking, and I'd never seen anything remotely like that creature before, and I haven't seen anything like it since. I've read books about Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some of the descriptions match what I saw pretty closely, but I never reported my encounter to any official channels or Bigfoot research groups. I guess I was afraid of the ridicule, or maybe I just wanted to keep the experience private somehow. It's been over 20 years now, and I still think about that day often. I've never gone back to that specific spot. Not because I'm afraid exactly, but more out of respect. That place feels like it belongs to whatever I saw that day, not to me or any other human. The strangest part? I wasn't really scared during the actual encounter. Startled and awestruck, yes. But the fear came after. What really got to me was the sudden realization that I'd spent my entire life in those woods, thinking I understood them, thinking I knew what was out there. And in the span of 30 seconds, everything I thought I knew was turned upside down. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I know what I didn't see. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit, wasn't a misidentified moose or elk. I know those animals. This was something else entirely. Something that made me feel small and insignificant in a way I've never felt before or since. I still hunt those forests, still love being out there alone, but I'm more aware now of how little we really know about the wild places that remain in this world. And sometimes, when I'm sitting quietly in the woods at dusk, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'm being watched by eyes I can't see. Story 6. I still don't know how to explain what I saw that day. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and it just doesn't make sense. But I know what I saw. I'm not crazy. I wasn't drunk, and I wasn't hallucinating. It happened last October, when I was out hunting in the Cascade foothills. I've been hunting there for years, so I know the area pretty well. It was a Friday afternoon, and I'd taken the day off work specifically to get some hunting in before the weekend crowds showed up. The weather was perfect, overcast but dry, with temperatures in the low 50s, the kind of quiet, still day that's ideal for predator calling. For those who don't hunt, predator calling is when you use a device to mimic the sound of an injured animal to attract predators like coyotes or bobcats. I was after coyotes that day. I'd been seeing a lot of their tracks in the area, and the local ranchers were complaining about losing calves, so the county had actually increased the limits for the season. I drove my truck down this old logging road about 7 miles into the forest. It's a spot I like because it's remote enough that most hunters don't bother with it. The road opens up to this small clearing that's surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides. Perfect spot to set up. I positioned my truck facing the open area with the forest behind me. My thinking was I could use the truck as a blind. Animals notice movement more than shapes, so sitting still in a vehicle can work pretty well as camouflage. I cracked the windows just enough for the sound to carry, maybe ½ an inch on each side. Then I set up my electronic predator call on the dashboard. It's this small device that plays various animal distress sounds. I chose the rabbit distress call, which is basically the sound of a rabbit being attacked. It's high-pitched and desperate, sounds horrible, but it's effective. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon. I'd been there maybe 15 minutes, occasionally playing the distress call for 30 seconds or so, then waiting 5 minutes, then repeating. I was being patient, scanning the clearing through my scope, when something made me check my rear-view mirror. I still don't know what made me look. It wasn't a sound, maybe it was just that feeling you get when you're being watched. But when I glanced in that mirror, my blood went cold. There was something standing behind a tree about 60 feet behind my truck. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it, maybe a bear standing upright or another hunter in dark clothes. But no, it was watching me, or at least watching my truck. And it was definitely not human or any animal I recognized. It was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I've never been the type to believe in this stuff. I've always laughed at those blurry photos and the TV shows about monster hunting. But what I saw was real. It was partly hidden behind a large Douglas fir, but I could see its right side. A massive shoulder, part of its torso and its arm. The arm is what convinced me this wasn't a person. It was proportionally too long, hanging straight down. When humans stand, our arms naturally have a slight bend at the elbow and kind of hang at an angle. This thing's arm hung straight down, almost to its knee, and it was thick, not fat, but muscular thick. I froze. Completely froze. The predator call was still making that rabbit distress noise, and I was terrified to move, to turn it off. I was afraid any movement would catch its attention. So I just sat there, barely breathing, watching it in my rearview mirror. It stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably about 30 seconds. Then, And this is what really freaked me out. It moved. It didn't just step from behind the tree. It shifted position, moving to another tree about 20 feet closer to my truck. The way it moved was efficient, quick but controlled. Not clumsy like a person in a suit would be. Now it was only about 40 feet behind me, close enough that I should have been able to make out facial features, but the combination of my tinted windows, the dimming afternoon light, and the fact that it kept most of its body behind the tree meant I could only see its general shape. But that shape was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, massive upper body that tapered somewhat at the waist, and those unnaturally long arms. The color was a dark brown, almost black. Not uniform, though. Lighter in some places, darker in others, and not smooth like fur in those documentaries about bears or wolves. It looked more, I don't know, matted maybe, like really dirty, tangled human hair, but all over its body. I couldn't see its legs well from my position, but the height, comparing it to the trees around it, had to be at least 6 feet, maybe more. It wasn't some giant 8-foot monster like you hear about in some stories, but it was big, solid, dense-looking. This whole time, I'm sitting in my truck with my hunting rifle across my lap, completely useless because I'm too scared to move. The rabbit distress call is still playing, and I'm wondering if that's what attracted it. Was it hunting the same thing I was? Did it think there was actually an injured rabbit? Or was it hunting me? After watching from that second tree for maybe another 30 seconds, it disappeared, just gone. I didn't see it move away. One moment it was there, and the next it wasn't. My first thought was that it had dropped down on all fours. The undergrowth was thick enough that if it got low to the ground, it could slip away without me seeing it through the mirror. I sat there for another 20 minutes without moving a muscle. The predator call had stopped automatically by then, and the silence was deafening. My hands were sweating so badly that my steering wheel was damp. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my eyeballs. Eventually, I had to make a decision. Should I get out and look for tracks? Hell no. Should I start the truck and get out of there? What if it was still nearby and the sound of the engine triggered it somehow? I was paralyzed with indecision. Then something else happened that gave me perspective. A cow elk walked out from almost the exact spot where I'd seen the creature. She was cautious, stopping every few steps to look around and sniff the air. She had no idea I was in the truck, but watching her walk through that same space gave me a reference for size. Adult cow elk stand about 4.5 feet at the shoulder. The Sasquatch had been significantly taller. I estimated about 6 feet, maybe a bit more. The elk's appearance somehow broke the spell of fear that had gripped me. I started the truck, put it in reverse, and backed up until I could turn around. I drove out of there, doing about 30 miles an hour on a road that should be taken at 10. I didn't care about the damage I was doing to my suspension. I just needed to get away. When I got home, I sat in my garage for nearly an hour before going inside. My wife asked why I was back so early, and I mumbled something about not feeling well. I couldn't tell her. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? The next day, I almost convinced myself it had been a bear, or maybe another hunter wearing dark clothing, but I know what I saw. The proportions were all wrong for a bear or a human. The way it moved, deliberate, controlled, intelligent, that wasn't an animal acting on instinct, at least not any animal officially recognized by science. I went back a week later in broad daylight with a buddy. I made up some story about losing a piece of equipment. We looked around where I thought the creature had been standing, but found nothing conclusive. No footprints, no hair, nothing broken or disturbed. My friend asked why I seemed so jumpy, and I just blamed it on too much coffee. I've been back hunting since then, but never alone. And never in that exact spot. I can't help wondering if it's still out there, and if it recognized what I was doing with that predator call. Was it curious about the technology? Was it hunting the same prey I was, or was it hunting me? I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I wouldn't believe it if someone told it to me. But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was standing there watching me through my truck window. Sometimes at night, I still hear that rabbit distress call in my dreams. And in those dreams, I'm the rabbit, and something large and dark is coming for me from behind the trees. Story 7. I still can't explain what happened to us that summer in Champion. Even now, typing this makes my hands shake. I've never shared the full story before because people would think I'm crazy. But after seeing others post similar experiences, I need to get this off my chest. I grew up in a modest house on the outskirts of Champion, Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Our place was pretty isolated. About a quarter mile of woods separated us from our nearest neighbors. As a kid, I loved the freedom of having all that space, but after what happened, I've never felt comfortable around dense forest again. It all began on a muggy July evening. I was 15 at the time, helping my dad stack firewood for the coming winter when Max, our German shepherd, suddenly went ballistic. Max wasn't a barker. He was well-trained and usually pretty chill. So when he started going crazy at the edge of the yard, hackles raised, we both stopped what we were doing. "What's gotten into him?" my dad muttered, shielding his eyes against the setting sun to see what Max was barking at. That's when I saw it for the first time. Standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by a thick oak, was something. My brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing at first. It was tall, way taller than my dad, who was 6 feet, and it stood upright on 2 legs. The sun was behind it, so I could only make out its silhouette, but what struck me was how massive it was. The shoulders were impossibly wide, and its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, like it had no neck at all. "Dad," I whispered, "do you see that?" He didn't answer, but I felt his hand grip my shoulder tight. We both stood frozen, staring at this thing, while Max went absolutely insane, barking and lunging against his chain. After what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, the figure stepped back and melted into the trees. No human moves like that, so fluid and silent despite its size. Once it disappeared, Dad finally spoke. "Get in the house. Now." That night, my parents tried to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe. A hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. My little sister, who was 7 at the time, suggested it was the Cookie Monster from Sesame Street, and the name kind of stuck between us, though there was nothing cute or funny about what we'd seen. Dad called the game warden the next morning, who basically laughed him off. Said bears were common enough in the area and can look surprisingly human-like when they stand up. He promised to swing by sometime that week, but I don't think he ever did. We might have convinced ourselves it was nothing, if not for what happened 3 nights later. I was up late doing summer reading for school when I heard Max start barking again, but different this time. More frantic, almost desperate. I went to my window, which overlooked our backyard, and pulled back the curtain. The motion-activated security light had triggered, illuminating the yard in harsh white light. And there it was, halfway between the tree line and our back porch. Seeing it in the light, I realized how wrong we'd been to think it could be a bear. This thing was massive, probably 7 feet tall at least, but it was the proportions that were all wrong. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and its shoulders had to be 3 feet wide. It was covered in dark hair or fur, not matted like a bear's, but smoother, almost shiny in the security light. The head was set forward, hunched between those massive shoulders, and though I couldn't make out facial features clearly, I could tell it was looking directly at our house. I was so terrified I couldn't even scream. I just stood there, paralyzed, watching as this thing swayed slightly, like it was deciding what to do. Then Max lunged at the end of his chain, and the creature turned toward him. I thought it would run away, but instead it took a step toward Max. That's when I finally found my voice and screamed for my dad. By the time my parents got to my room, the thing had disappeared again. Dad grabbed his shotgun and went outside to check on Max, who was still barking like crazy. He found nothing except some weird impressions in the soft ground near the edge of the light's reach. Not really footprints, but disturbed areas where something heavy had stood. After that night, we started calling it the Cookie Monster regularly, not because it was funny anymore, but because giving it a name somehow made it less terrifying. My sister was too young to really understand, and the name helped her process what was happening without being too scared. The visits became more frequent. We'd hear heavy footsteps on the porch at night. Food would go missing from our outdoor freezer, even though the door was still closed. Once all our trash cans were knocked over and emptied, but not like raccoons do it. Everything was laid out in almost neat piles, like something had been searching methodically through our garbage. Dad installed more security lights and started locking Max in the garage at night for his protection. We stopped going outside after dark, period. My mum called the police twice, but they found nothing and eventually suggested we might have teenagers messing with us. The worst night, the night everything changed, happened in August, about 3 weeks after our first sighting. My parents had gone to my aunt's house about 30 miles away, leaving me in charge of my sister. They called around 9 o'clock to say they were heading home. Around 10:30, I heard a car horn blaring continuously from the direction of our long driveway. It was still going as I ran to the front window, thinking my parents were trying to alert us they were home. What I saw instead will haunt me forever. Their car was about 50 yards from the house, headlights cutting through the darkness, horn blaring. The car was rocking violently from side to side, not like someone was inside hitting the horn and shaking in their seat. The entire car was being lifted and rocked like a toy. I could make out a massive dark figure on the driver's side, and even from the house, I could hear my mum screaming. I grabbed Dad's shotgun from the closet, told my sister to hide in her room and lock the door, and ran outside. I was terrified, but more afraid of what would happen if I did nothing. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, the motion lights came on, and the creature dropped the car and turned toward the sudden brightness. For just a moment it was fully illuminated. I wish I could say my memory is fuzzy, but I remember every detail. It was at least 7.5 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark brown, almost black hair, except for the chest, which had lighter patches. The face was the worst part, not quite human, not quite animal. The jaw protruded forward, and its eyes reflected the light like a deer's, but they were spaced like a human's. It had a flattened nose and a heavy brow ridge. Those eyes locked on me, and I felt something I can't explain, a terrible intelligence, an awareness that this was no animal. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking so badly I'm not sure I could have hit anything. The creature made a sound then, not a growl or roar, but a deep rumbling sound that felt like it vibrated through my chest. Then it turned and moved into the woods with shocking speed, covering ground in long, fluid strides that no human could match. My parents' car sped up the driveway, tires throwing gravel. Dad had a bloody nose, and Mom was hysterical. They'd been driving home when something massive stepped in front of their car. Dad had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting it. Before they could react, the thing had reached the driver's side door, grabbed the frame of the car, and started violently rocking it. The door frame was dented inward, and there were distinct, finger-like impressions in the metal. We called the police, who took a report but seemed skeptical until they saw the damage to the car. They searched the woods but found nothing. The officer suggested it might be someone in a costume trying to scare us, maybe with some kind of mechanical assistance to tip the car. Dad lost it at that point, shouting that no person in a costume could have done what we'd seen. That's when we realized Max wasn't barking anymore. Dad and the officer went to the garage, and I'll never forget my father's howl of anguish. Max was still alive, barely, but he'd been, I don't know how to describe it without being sick. It was like something had tried to tear him in half. The garage door was intact, but the small window was broken inward. The officer called for backup and an animal control unit, thinking maybe a bear had gotten in somehow. We rushed Max to the emergency vet, but he didn't make it. The vet said she'd never seen injuries like that, not consistent with a bear or mountain lion attack. The wounds seemed almost deliberate, like whatever did this wanted to cause pain, not just kill for food. After that night, the sightings continued, but changed in nature. The creature seemed more cautious, but also more persistent. We'd catch glimpses of it watching the house from just within the tree line. Sometimes we'd hear wood knocking sounds from different directions, like it was communicating with others. Twice, we found strange arrangements of sticks on our property that looked deliberately placed. Mum wanted to move, but Dad refused to be driven from his home. He installed cameras, but they'd mysteriously malfunction whenever something appeared. The police finally stopped responding to our calls, and neighbors started avoiding us, like our craziness might be contagious. The last direct encounter I had was about a month later. I was taking the trash out at dusk, breaking our no outside after dark rule, when I heard heavy breathing behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was, standing about 20 feet away between me and the house. Up close, in the fading light, I could see more details. Its fingers were long, too long, with dark nails that looked almost like claws. Its feet were massive and seemed to grip the ground in a way that's hard to describe, and the smell, a powerful musky odor mixed with something rotten. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. I expected to die right there. Instead, it made that same rumbling sound I'd heard before, then deliberately placed something on the ground between us. It backed away, still watching me, then turned and walked into the forest. Not running this time, walking upright, arms swinging at its sides in an almost human gait. When I was sure it was gone, I approached what it had left. It was Max's collar, which had been missing since the night he was killed. We moved 2 weeks later. Dad finally gave in after Mum threatened to take us kids and leave without him. We never went back, not even to visit. I heard from a former neighbor that the new owners tore down the house after less than a year and left the property abandoned. I've never told the full story until now. For years, I convinced myself it was some kind of bear, or maybe even a person playing an elaborate, cruel hoax. But deep down, I know what we experienced in Champion wasn't anything science can explain. When I see reports of Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania, I don't laugh like most people. I check to see how close they were to Somerset County. And I remember what we called our monster. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching other families from just beyond the tree line. Story 8. I still get chills thinking about what happened that day in '77. May 1st, 1977. I remember because it was just before my birthday, and I was looking forward to turning 14 the following week. But after what happened, I didn't even care about my birthday anymore. I lived north of Montrose, on the old airport road in Montrose County, Colorado. It was mostly farmland and open spaces back then. Our house wasn't anything special, just a single-story ranch-style place with big windows that my mom loved because they let the outside in. After what happened, I wish those windows had been smaller or non-existent. That day, my parents had gone into town to get supplies. It was just me and my friend Todd at the house. We were typical bored teenagers with nothing better to do than listen to music and complain about how there was nothing happening in our small town. It was getting toward evening, and we were just hanging out in the living room. The sun was starting to set, and that golden-orange light was coming through the windows. Todd was telling me about some girl he liked at school, and I was half listening while flipping through a magazine. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a normal day, until it wasn't. "Hey," Todd said suddenly, his voice going weird. "There's something looking through the front door window." I laughed at first. Yeah, right. But the look on his face wasn't joking. His eyes were wide, and his face had gone pale. I turned to look at the front door, and my blood turned to ice. There was a face staring in at us through the window at the top of the door. But it wasn't a normal face. I can't even explain it properly. It had a coconut-shaped head, wider at the top than the bottom. And its eyes, God, those eyes, they were dark and deep-set, and they were intelligent. That's what scared me the most. There was a mind behind those eyes, watching us, studying us. The thing is, our front door was pretty tall. The window was easily 7 feet off the ground. Whatever was looking in at us was huge. "What the fuck is that?" I whispered, not even realizing I was speaking. Todd didn't answer. We just stared at it, and it stared at us. Then it moved slightly, and we both jumped backward. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "We need to get the gun," Todd said, his voice shaking. My dad kept a .22 rifle in the hall closet for varmints. Not that this thing was any kind of varmint I'd ever seen. We backed away slowly, not taking our eyes off the door. The face disappeared from the window, which somehow was even worse. Now we couldn't see where it was. We made a dash for the hall closet. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open it. Todd grabbed the rifle while I dug for the ammunition box on the shelf. My fingers kept slipping, and I dropped several bullets before finally getting a handful. Then we heard it. From the other side of the house, near my mother's bedroom, a deep, heavy breathing sound and scratching, like something with claws was scraping at the window screen. "It's at the back of the house," I hissed. We crept down the hallway toward my mother's room. The breathing got louder. It wasn't like human breathing. It was deeper, more resonant, like something with massive lungs. My own breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps that I couldn't control. Todd had the rifle ready, and I was clutching extra ammunition, though I wasn't sure what good a .22 would do against whatever this thing was. We reached my mother's door, which was partially open. The scratching sound was unmistakable now, coming from her window. I pushed the door open with my foot, too terrified to use my hand. What I saw will haunt me until the day I die. Pressed against my mother's window screen was a hand, but not a human hand. This thing was massive. The palm alone was probably the size of my entire face, with fingers that looked like they could wrap all the way around my torso. The skin was dark, covered in what looked like coarse hair. And to reach that window, which was about 8 feet off the ground outside, the creature had to be at least 10 feet tall. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen in absolute terror. The hand pressed harder against the screen, and the metal frame started to bend inward. Todd raised the rifle. His hands were shaking almost as badly as mine, but he managed to aim at the window. He fired twice in quick succession. The shots were deafening in the small bedroom. The hand disappeared instantly. We heard a heavy thud outside, followed by the sound of something large moving quickly away from the house. Branches snapped, and the ground seemed to shake slightly with each of its steps. "Did you hit it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Todd said. He was as white as a sheet. We were too scared to go outside and check. Instead, we locked every door and window in the house and sat in the living room with the lights off, the rifle across Todd's lap. We didn't talk, we just listened, jumping at every creak and groan of the house, every rustle of wind in the trees outside. When my parents finally came home around 9 that night, we were still sitting there in the dark. My mum flipped on the lights and nearly screamed when she saw us sitting there with the gun. Of course, they didn't believe us at first. My dad checked outside with his flashlight, but didn't see anything unusual. He found the bullet holes in my mum's window screen, though, which got me in a lot of trouble until Todd took the blame, saying he was showing me the gun, and it accidentally went off. But my dad must have been more concerned than he let on, because the next morning he called the sheriff. I overheard him on the phone, describing what we'd claimed to see and asking them to come take a look, probably thinking they'd tell us it was just our imagination. The sheriff came out that afternoon. He was a big guy with a mustache who looked like he didn't believe a word of what we were saying. But he humored us, walking around the outside of the house, examining the ground beneath my mother's window. He confirmed finding the bullet holes in the screen, but said there was no blood or footprints. "Ground's pretty hard here," he said. "Would need something real heavy to leave a mark." Before he left, he pulled me aside. "Son," he said, looking me straight in the eyes, "you sure you boys weren't just playing around? Maybe had a few beers when your folks were out?" "No, sir," I said. "We saw something. It was real." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Well, keep your doors locked at night. Probably just a bear, though they don't usually stand up like that or look in windows. But animals get curious sometimes. But it wasn't a bear. I know what bears look like. This was something else entirely." After that day, my parents didn't leave us alone in the house anymore. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be, when I was jumping at every shadow and couldn't sleep without a light on. About 3 weeks later, Todd and I were walking back from the convenience store about a mile from my house. It was late afternoon, and we were taking a shortcut along the old dirt road that ran behind the properties in our area. We were just talking about normal stuff, some new band that Todd was into, when we both stopped dead in our tracks. Standing in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead of us was a large, dark figure. It was standing on 2 feet, just like a person, but it was huge, easily 10 feet tall. It had a human-like form, but the proportions were all wrong. Too big, too bulky. Even from that distance, I could see that its arms hung down almost to its knees. For a second, it didn't move. It just stood there, a black silhouette against the golden afternoon light. Then it turned its head toward us, and even though I couldn't see its eyes from that distance, I could feel it looking at us, recognizing us. We didn't hesitate. We didn't speak. We just ran. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life, cutting across fields, jumping fences, not even looking back to see if it was following us. We didn't stop until we reached my house, bursting through the front door, sweating and gasping for breath. My mum was in the kitchen and rushed out to see what was wrong. We tried to tell her, but we were so out of breath and terrified that it just came out as gibberish. She made us sit down, gave us water, and finally got the story out of us. "It was probably just a deer standing on its hind legs," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "Or maybe someone walking their dog. But she locked the doors anyway. I never saw it again after that day, but I never forgot it either. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I can hear that heavy breathing outside my window." I moved away from Montrose as soon as I could after high school, and I've never gone back. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, and some descriptions sound similar to what we saw, but whatever was outside our house that day in 1977 wasn't just some fuzzy forest creature from the tabloids. It was intelligent. It knew we were alone. It was trying to get in, 45 years later, and I still check the locks twice before I go to bed. I still can't sleep in a room with uncovered windows, and I still remember those eyes looking in at us through the door, studying us like we were the strange creatures, not it. I don't have an explanation for what happened that day. The sheriff never found anything. My parents eventually convinced themselves we'd made it up. Even Todd, last time I talked to him years ago, had started to question his own memory of that day, but I know what I saw, and I know it was real. Story 9. I haven't told many people about this. For years, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. You know how kids are, right? But I'm 69 years old now, and I still remember that night in the spring of 1963, like it was yesterday. Some things just stick with you, and no matter how much time passes, they never really fade. We lived in North Fort Myers back then, in Lee County, Florida. I was just 9 years old. Our house wasn't anything fancy, just a simple family home sitting on the corner of a state drive. There was a canal about a stone's throw away, and US Highway 41 was just a block over. The neighborhood was what people called developing at the time, which basically meant they were slowly building houses where there used to be woods. But there were still plenty of wild places around. Overgrown lots, patches of dense woods, and those Florida swamps that never seemed to end. That spring, there had been talk around town about something strange in the woods. The Fort Myers news press had run a couple of articles about Bigfoot sightings in the area. People claimed to have seen a large, hairy creature walking upright in the woods not far from where we lived. Most adults laughed it off. My dad would shake his head when he read the articles, muttering something about folks with nothing better to do than make up stories. My mom was a bit more diplomatic about it. People see all sorts of things in the shadows, she'd say, especially when they're looking for something to see. But for us kids, these stories were both terrifying and thrilling. We'd whisper about them during recess, trying to scare each other with made-up details. I remember feeling this weird mix of fear and excitement every time I walked past a wooded area, half hoping I'd catch a glimpse of something extraordinary, half praying I wouldn't. Our bedroom arrangement at home was a bit unusual. I shared a room with both my sister and my grandmother. My parents had the master bedroom, and my grandmother had moved in with us a few years earlier when my grandfather passed away. She slept in a twin bed on one side of the room, while my sister and I had our beds against the opposite wall. Our window faced the side yard, which was mostly just grass with a few young trees my dad had planted. The night it happened was a Tuesday, I think. It was warm, as spring nights in Florida tend to be. We'd had dinner like normal. My mom had made meatloaf, which I never really liked but ate anyway. I remember watching some TV with my dad before bedtime, some Western show he enjoyed. Nothing unusual about the day at all. I went to bed around 9, which was my usual bedtime on school nights. My sister was already asleep. She was 7, and somehow could fall asleep the moment her head hit the pillow. My grandmother came to bed about half an hour later. She had her nighttime routine. She'd brush her teeth, put on her nightgown, say her prayers kneeling by her bed, and then climb in with a little sigh. I couldn't sleep that night. I just lay there, listening to my sister's soft breathing and my grandmother's occasional snore. The house had these jalousie windows, you know, the kind with glass slats that you crank open. We usually kept them partially open at night to let the breeze in. There was a screen, of course, to keep the bugs out. It must have been around 10 o'clock. I was still wide awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the water stains. There were 3 that looked like animals, one like a rabbit, one like a turtle, and one that my sister thought looked like a fish. Like a hippo, but I thought was more like a pig. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the hall clock and the distant sound of a car occasionally passing on Highway 41. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, moving through the grass outside our window. Slow, deliberate steps that made a soft swish through the grass, followed by a dull thud as whatever it was put its weight down. These weren't the footsteps of a person trying to be quiet. They were unhurried, casual almost, like whatever was walking out there didn't care if it was heard. At first, I thought it might be my dad checking something outside, but my dad wasn't a big man. He was about 5'8" and slim. These footsteps sounded heavy, like someone much bigger. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly racing. The footsteps were getting closer to my window. I remember the moonlight was bright that night, bright enough that when I looked toward the window, I could clearly see the yard outside. Then something blocked the moonlight. A shadow moved across the window, and my entire body went cold with fear. It was huge, not just tall, but massive. The shadow was distinctly bipedal, walking upright on 2 legs with a gait that was eerily human-like, but with something off about it, something wrong. The stride was too long, the movement too fluid for its size, and it was tall. So tall, our windows were probably about 5 feet off the ground, and this thing, its shoulders or upper body were well above the window line. I could see its silhouette against the night sky as it passed. Broad-shouldered and somehow both human and not human at all, I was frozen, unable to move or call out. The shadow passed slowly, taking maybe 3 or 4 seconds to cross the span of the window. I kept waiting for it to pass completely, for the moonlight to return, but the darkness lingered longer than it should have. as if whatever cast that shadow was much larger than what I could see. Then, just as the shadow finally moved past, I heard a sound that I still sometimes hear in my nightmares. It was a moan, low-pitched and rumbling, not like an animal growl or a human groan, but something in between. It started low and then rose slightly before fading away. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but it seemed to vibrate through the walls, through my bed, through my chest. I felt that sound as much as I heard it. That was when my paralysis broke. I literally leapt from my bed, not climbed, not got up quickly. I jumped out like it was on fire. I ran out of the room, down the short hallway to my parents' bedroom, sobbing and shaking. I burst into their room without knocking. My dad was still awake, reading a magazine with the bedside lamp on. My mom had been dozing, but startled awake when I came in. "What's wrong?" my dad asked, immediately putting his magazine down. I tried to explain what I'd seen and heard, but I was crying so hard, my words came out jumbled and broken. Outside, big walking sound. I remember pointing frantically toward my bedroom, trying to make them understand. My mom pulled me onto their bed, wrapping her arms around me. "Shh, it's okay," she said, stroking my hair. "You were having a bad dream." "No," I insisted, pulling away from her. "I was awake. I saw it. It walked right past my window." My dad got up and went to the window in their room, peering out into the yard. "I don't see anything out there," he said after a moment. But something in his voice made me think he wasn't entirely convinced. He turned to me. "What exactly did you see?" I tried to describe it as best as a 9-year-old could. It was big. Really big, like a giant person, but not a person. It walked past my window and made this weird sound. My dad frowned. "Stay here with your mother," he said, and left the room. I heard the front door open and close a few minutes later. My mom kept trying to convince me it was just a dream, that I'd fallen asleep without realizing it, and had a nightmare. But I knew I hadn't been asleep. I knew what I'd seen was real. About 10 minutes later, my dad came back in. He looked puzzled. "I walked all around the house," he said. "Didn't see anything out of the ordinary. No footprints or anything like that." "But I saw it," I insisted. My parents exchanged a look, the kind adults give each other when they're dealing with a child's imagination. "Why don't you sleep in here with us tonight?" my mum suggested. I did, curling up between them, still trembling occasionally as I replayed what I'd seen in my mind. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, everything seemed so normal it was almost surreal. Sunshine streamed through the windows, birds were chirping, and my mom was making breakfast like any other day. My dad had already left for work. My sister was chattering away about some school project, completely unaware of what had happened during the night. My grandmother mentioned I must have had a bad dream since I wasn't in my bed when she woke up during the night to use the bathroom. I felt like I was in a weird bubble, separate from everyone else. How could they all be so normal when something so terrifying had happened? At school that day during lunch, I finally worked up the courage to mention what I'd seen to a couple of friends. To my surprise, they didn't laugh or tell me I was making it up. "My cousin saw something like that last week," one of them said, leaning in close. "By the woods near Pine Island Road." Another kid chimed in. "My dad was driving home late from work and said he saw something big run across the road near the canal. He said it was too big to be a deer and moved on 2 legs. Those conversations made it both better and worse. Better because I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. Worse because it confirmed that there really was something out there. I dreaded going to bed that night. My dad checked all the windows and doors twice before bedtime, which he never usually did. He didn't say why, but I knew it was because of what I'd told them. My mom left the hallway light on and my bedroom door open a crack in case I had another bad dream. Nothing happened that night or any night after. Whatever had walked past my window that spring night in 1963 never returned. At least, not that I ever saw or heard. For weeks afterward, I'd tense up at any unusual sound at night. I'd stare at that window, half expecting to see that massive shadow again, but as time passed, the memory became less immediate, though no less vivid. My parents eventually convinced themselves I'd had a nightmare, especially when no more strange sightings were reported in the newspaper. The Bigfoot stories faded from local gossip, replaced by talk of new housing developments and the upcoming hurricane season. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. That low, vibrating moan still echoes in my memory sometimes when I'm half asleep. That shadow, impossibly large against the moonlight, is seared into my mind. We moved away from that house about 2 years later when my dad got a job in Tampa. I never experienced anything like that again, but I've never forgotten it either. Over the years, whenever I've read about Bigfoot sightings or unexplained creatures, I get that same cold feeling in the pit of my stomach. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just telling you what I experienced. A massive bipedal creature walked past my window that night. It made a sound no human or known animal could make. It was there, whether anyone believes me or not. Sometimes I wonder if it knew I was watching, if it sensed me there, a frightened child on the other side of that thin window, and sometimes in my darkest thoughts, I wonder if it was looking for something or someone that night in North Fort Myers. Story 10. I've been hesitating to write this down for years now. What we saw that day in Wolf Park back in September of 1994 still gives me chills when I think about it. I'm not some conspiracy nut or attention seeker. I'm just a regular guy who likes to hunt. But what happened that day, I still can't explain it. It was muzzle loading season and me and 2 buddies decided to head out deer hunting at Wolf Park. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. You know that sweet spot in early fall when the leaves are just starting to turn but haven't fallen yet. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, cleaned our muzzle loaders, packed all our gear, and gotten up at the crack of dawn to drive out there. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours when we spotted what we thought was a bear on the slope about 200 yards away. Now, we were there for deer, not bear, and none of us wanted to deal with that kind of trouble. Plus, bear season wasn't open yet, and we didn't want to spook it and have it come charging at us. Safety first, you know. So we decided to relocate to another spot. We hiked back to my buddy's truck, an old Ford that had seen better days but could handle the mountain roads better than most new vehicles. We drove southwest down the mountain, following this winding dirt road that honestly made my stomach turn with each hairpin curve. The drop-offs on the side were no joke. One wrong move and we'd be tumbling down hundreds of feet. After driving for about 30 to 45 minutes, we rounded this corner that opened up to this amazing overlook of the park. You could see for miles, the valley below, the dense forest, small clearings here and there. It was breathtaking, and I remember thinking we should stop and take it in for a minute. I didn't have to say anything though, because my buddy slammed on the brakes so hard, I nearly hit the dashboard. The truck skidded a bit on the gravel before coming to a complete stop. "Holy shit, do you see that?" he whispered, pointing through the windshield, and that's when I saw them. 2 large, I don't even know what to call them. Creatures? Beings? They were standing in a clearing about 200 yards away. At first I thought they might be bears standing on their hind legs, but something was off. Way off. "What the hell are those?" I said, my voice barely audible. My other friend in the back seat leaned forward between us, his breathing heavy in my ear. "Are those people? Hunters wearing ghillie suits, maybe?" But deep down, I knew they weren't humans. They were too big, too different. We sat there frozen, watching them through the windshield. Neither of us thought to grab our binoculars at first. We were just stunned into silence. These things were massive. I'd guess 7 to 8 feet tall at least, and they were jet black. Not the brownish black of a bear, but pitch black, like oil. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, I snapped out of it and grabbed my binoculars from my pack at my feet. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely focus them. When I finally got a clear view, my heart nearly stopped. These weren't bears. They had clearly defined arms, legs, torsos, and heads, very humanoid in shape, but definitely not human. The proportions were all wrong. Their arms hung down almost to their knees, and they seemed to be covered in what looked like short, dense fur or hair. "Guys," I whispered, "these aren't bears. Look at how they're standing, how they're moving." They were standing upright, completely comfortable on two legs, occasionally shifting their weight or turning to look in different directions. They seemed to be, I don't know, surveying the area, like they were keeping watch or something. Then something even more bizarre happened. As we watched, three smaller creatures emerged from a drawer to our right. They were about half the size of the two bigger ones, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, but with the same jet black appearance and humanoid shape. They moved differently though, more energetic, almost playful. "Are those young ones?" my friend in the back whispered. The thought sent a chill down my spine. We were witnessing some kind of family unit. The smaller ones moved toward the larger ones, and one of the big creatures, maybe the female, seemed to reach out toward them in an almost protective gesture. We sat there watching them for what must have been several minutes, though it felt like hours. None of us spoke. I don't think any of us were even breathing normally. I remember my mouth being bone dry, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The creatures moved around the clearing, never venturing too far from each other. They seemed completely unaware of our presence, which made sense given the distance and the fact that we were hidden by the truck. The wind was blowing toward us too, so they couldn't have caught our scent. I remember noticing details that seem even stranger in hindsight. They moved with a kind of fluid grace that didn't seem possible for something so large. When they turned or bent down, there was a smoothness to it that was almost hypnotic, and they made no sound that we could hear from our position. No calls, no communication that we could detect. Then suddenly, everything changed. A white pickup truck appeared on the road below them, maybe 75 to 100 yards from the largest creature. It was just crawling along, probably some park ranger or another hunter. The reaction was immediate. All 5 creatures froze for a split second. Then the largest one made some kind of motion, not a gesture exactly, but a movement that seemed to communicate urgency to the others. And then, in a blur of movement that still doesn't seem possible, all 5 of them vanished into the brush. They didn't run away in panic like deer would. It was more deliberate, more coordinated. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, swallowed up by the thick underbrush on the hillside. The 3 of us sat in stunned silence for several minutes after they disappeared. My friend behind the wheel was the first to speak. "Did we just see what I think we saw?" His voice was shaky, uncertain. "Bigfoot," I said, the word feeling strange in my mouth. "We just saw a family of Bigfoot." My other friend laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the kind of laugh you do when you're uncomfortable, when your brain is trying to process something it can't understand. "No way," he said. That's not possible." But we all knew what we'd seen. After discussing it for a few minutes, we decided to drive down to where they had been. I don't know what we were thinking. That we'd find evidence, maybe? That we could prove to ourselves we hadn't all hallucinated the same thing? We had to backtrack a bit to find a road that would take us down to that area. It took us almost 20 minutes to get there. The whole time, none of us talked much. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. When we finally reached the clearing, it felt different than it had looked from above. The brush was thicker, the terrain steeper and more uneven than it had appeared from our vantage point. The ground was loose, a mix of dirt, gravel, and small rocks that shifted under our boots. We spread out, looking for tracks or any sign of the creatures. but the ground was too unstable. Any prints that might have been there had been erased by the shifting gravel or were too distorted to make out clearly. I remember kneeling down, running my hand over the ground and feeling this weird sense of disconnect. Like, had we really seen what we thought we saw? Was my mind playing tricks on me? But then my buddy called out from a few yards away, "Guys, check this out." We hurried over to where he was standing. He was pointing at a small bush whose branches had been broken, not in the random way that happens naturally, but in a pattern that suggested something large had pushed through it. And not just pushed through it, but deliberately moved it aside. "Something big came through here," he said, his voice low. We followed the direction of the broken brush, but it quickly led into a thicket so dense we couldn't push through without machetes. The branches were interwoven like a natural fence, and trying to force our way through would have made so much noise that anything hiding in there would have heard us coming from a mile away. Plus, if these were what we thought they were, did we really want to corner them? The thought of those massive creatures potentially feeling threatened by us was enough to make my skin crawl. We stood there for a while, staring into the thicket, each lost in our own thoughts. I remember feeling this weird mix of fear and awe, like we'd stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to see, something that existed in the shadows of our world, rarely glimpsed by human eyes. Finally, we decided to leave. None of us said it out loud, but I think we all felt the same thing, that we were intruders there, that we'd witnessed something few people ever get to see, and that pushing our luck further might not be wise. The drive back was quiet. We tried to talk about it, to process what we'd seen, but the words felt inadequate. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? How do you make sense of seeing creatures that are supposed to be myths, legends? We made a pact that day to tell people about what we saw, not because we thought anyone would believe us. Honestly, I wouldn't believe it if someone told me this story, but because it felt important to record it somehow, to acknowledge that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that exist beyond our everyday experience. It's been years since that day, and I still don't have answers. I've researched Bigfoot sightings in that area, read countless accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar creatures. Some of the descriptions match what we saw so closely. It makes my hair stand on end. But in the end, all I have is what I saw with my own eyes that September day in 1994. 5 creatures, jet black and humanoid, moving with impossible grace through a clearing in Wolf Park, and then vanishing like ghosts back into the wilderness that they call home. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering if they're still out there. Those 5 black figures moving silently through the forests, watching us even as we search for them. Story 11. I'm still not sure if I should be writing this. My wife thinks I should just let it go. But I can't stop thinking about what we heard. It's been years now, and I still find myself waking up around 3 in the morning, listening for those sounds. We live in Washington State, at the highest point of our development. Our house backs up to this dense patch of woods that drops off pretty steeply behind our property. From our backyard, it's about 300 yards of unbroken forest before you hit the next development. Our house sits at about 700 feet elevation, right by the neighborhood water tower. I've always loved our location. During the day, it's peaceful, and the view from our back windows is nothing but trees. At night, though, especially after what happened, those same woods feel different. My bedroom window looks directly out over this wooded area. I used to love sleeping with the window cracked open, especially in the summer when it gets stuffy inside. Not anymore. It started back in late August of 2012. My wife and I had gone to bed around 11. Nothing unusual about the night. The temperature was perfect, so I had the window open a few inches to let in the cool night air. I remember waking up suddenly at around 2:45 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it. This high-pitched, piercing shriek came from the woods behind our house. It's hard to describe exactly what it sounded like. It wasn't an owl or a fox or any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was almost human, but not quite. Too powerful, too wild. My wife woke up right after me, grabbing my arm so tight it left marks. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was frozen, listening as the shriek came again, even longer this time. It echoed through the trees, seeming to bounce off the water tower and come back even louder. We both got out of bed and went to the window. The woods were pitch black. We couldn't see anything moving out there. But the sounds continued. These awful, piercing shrieks, one after another. They didn't sound like they were coming from the same spot either. It was like whatever was making them was moving through the trees, circling around behind our property. The shrieking went on for about 5 minutes, though it felt much longer. Then the strangest thing happened. It started to rain, just a light drizzle at first, and the second the first drops hit our window, the shrieking stopped, just stopped completely. The sudden silence was almost as unsettling as the sounds had been. We stayed up for another hour, watching the woods, but there was nothing, just the soft sound of rain on the leaves. I told myself it was probably just some animal in distress, maybe a deer being attacked by coyotes or something. But deep down, I knew better. I've lived around wildlife my whole life. This was something else. My wife and I didn't talk much about it the next day. What was there to say? We had no explanation, and in the daylight, it seemed less threatening somehow. Life went on. Weeks passed. I almost managed to convince myself it had been nothing important. Then came early October, about 5 weeks after the first incident. Again, we were asleep. This time it was around 3 in the morning when I jerked awake. 2 sharp screams cut through the quiet night, followed immediately by this bizarre whooping sound. It's so hard to describe these noises in words. The whoops were deep and resonant, almost like someone trying to imitate a monkey or an ape, but with this weird guttural quality to them. My wife was still asleep somehow, but I was wide awake, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The whooping continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I was about to wake my wife when I heard another series of whoops responding from much further away, maybe half a mile off in the distance, deeper in the woods. Then the strangest thing happened. When the distant whoops responded, the closer ones would stop. Then, when the closer ones started again, the distant ones would go quiet. It was like they were communicating, taking turns. This call and response pattern continued for several minutes. I finally shook my wife awake, but by the time she was conscious enough to listen, the sounds had stopped. She thought I was having a bad dream, and honestly, part of me wished I was. I spent the next day researching animal sounds online. Nothing matched what I'd heard. I found recordings of foxes, owls, cougars, bears. None of them made those whooping sounds. I even checked if there were any primates that might have escaped from somewhere, but there was nothing in the news about anything like that. The third incident happened in mid-October, about 2 weeks after the second one. This time it was around 3:15 in the morning. I was already half awake. Ever since the second incident, I'd been sleeping poorly, always listening for those sounds. The whooping started again from the same direction as before, but this time I could clearly distinguish 2 separate sets of vocalizations coming from different locations in the woods. They weren't taking turns anymore. They were communicating back and forth, separated by just a few seconds. One was definitely closer to our house than the other. What really freaked me out this time was the neighborhood dogs. They all started barking frantically, all at once. We're talking about dogs from at least 5 or 6 different houses, all going crazy at exactly the same time. And their barking was focused in the direction of the whooping sounds. Whatever was out there, the dogs knew it was there too. This wasn't just in my head. The whoops started coming closer together, almost overlapping. It sounded like they were moving, getting closer to each other, and closer to our house. My wife was wide awake now too, clutching my arm again. Both of us just sitting there in bed, too scared to go to the window. Then, after maybe 3 or 4 minutes of this, the sounds seemed to move away from the house. The whooping got fainter, the dogs quieted down, and eventually everything just stopped. We sat there for at least an hour afterward, not talking, just listening, but there was nothing else that night. The next day, I started asking around the neighborhood, trying to see if anyone else had heard anything strange. A couple of people mentioned their dogs acting weird lately, especially at night, but nobody specifically mentioned hearing screams or whoops. Either they hadn't heard them or they weren't comfortable talking about it. I became obsessed with trying to record the sounds. I set up my phone to record audio all night, placing it on the windowsill. I did this for 2 weeks straight, but of course, the sounds never came back during that time. It was like whatever was out there knew I was listening for it now. I've spent a lot of time researching since then. I've gone down all kinds of rabbit holes online, cryptozoology forums, wildlife resources, even local indigenous legends. Nothing quite matches what we experienced. The closest thing I've found is accounts of Sasquatch or Bigfoot vocalizations. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I was never into that stuff before. I always thought Bigfoot was just a myth, something for TV shows and conspiracy theorists. But the descriptions of the whooping, the call and response behavior, the way they seem to communicate, it all lines up with what I heard. There's a part of me that still wants to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was some weird atmospheric phenomenon that made normal animal sounds distort. Maybe it was people playing an elaborate prank. But who would be out in those woods at 3 in the morning, multiple times, making those inhuman sounds? And why did they stop so suddenly when it started raining that first night? Why did they seem to be communicating with each other? Why did all the neighborhood dogs react at once? It's been over 10 years now, and we haven't heard those sounds again, but I still wake up sometimes around 3 in the morning, my heart racing, thinking I heard something. I've never slept with the window open since then. I still live in the same house. During the day, I look out at those woods and they're just trees, just a normal forest. But at night, especially around 3 a.m., I can't help but wonder what's out there, moving between the trees, communicating in those eerie whoops and screams. The scariest part? I sometimes get this feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting, like they know we heard them, and they're being more careful now. I can't explain why I feel that way. I just do. I don't have answers. I don't have proof. All I have is what I heard on those 3 nights in 2012, and this lingering feeling that there's something out there in those woods that science hasn't explained yet. Story 12. I've tried telling this story to a few people over the years, but most think I'm either crazy or making it up. I can understand the skepticism. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But what I experienced that day near Mount St. Helens in the fall of 1997 has haunted me for decades now. I've spent most of my life in Western Washington. My dad taught me to hunt when I was 12, and I've been tramping through these forests ever since. I know the woods. I know what bears look like when they move through brush. I know what elk sound like when they're feeding. I've seen cougars, bobcats, and just about every other animal native to the Pacific Northwest. What I saw that day wasn't any of those things. My buddy Mark had invited me on a week-long hunting trip. He'd found this spot off an old logging road that branched off Highway 504, about 20 miles from the visitor center at Mount St. Helens. The area was remote. You had to navigate a maze of unmarked dirt roads to reach our campsite, which sat in a small clearing surrounded by second-growth forest. Perfect elk country. The first couple days were uneventful. We saw some tracks, heard some bugling in the distance, but didn't get close enough for a shot. The weather was typical for October in the Cascades, misty mornings giving way to cool, overcast afternoons with occasional patches of sunlight breaking through. We'd head out in different directions each morning, meet back at camp for lunch, then try different spots in the afternoon. On the third day, something felt different from the moment I woke up. There was a stillness in the air that wasn't normal. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even Mark noticed it. "Feels weird today," he said as we ate breakfast. "Pressure's changing. Might get some weather moving in." I nodded, but something about the silence felt more ominous than just an approaching storm. Still, I shrugged it off. We'd planned to hunt separately that afternoon, with Mark working a ridgeline to the north, while I followed an old skid trail that cut down into a ravine about a mile east of camp. Around 4 in the afternoon, I was making my way slowly along that trail. The temperature had dropped, and a light mist had settled among the trees. Visibility was decent, maybe 100 yards in open areas, less in the thick stuff. I had my Remington .270 slung over my shoulder, moving as quietly as possible, scanning the area ahead and below me. The skid trail curved around a bend, and I slowed my pace even more. This kind of spot, where the trail changed direction, was perfect for surprising an elk that might be moving below. I took a deep breath and eased around the curve, then froze. About 50 yards downslope, something dark was moving through the brush in the clear-cut below the trail. My first thought was, bear. We'd seen sign of them in the area. But as I watched, crouched behind the trunk of a young hemlock, I realized this wasn't a bear. It wasn't moving on all fours. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The thing stepped clear of the brush, and I got my first unobstructed view. It was walking upright like a person, but everything else about it was wrong, all wrong. It was massive, not just tall, though it had to be at least 7 feet, but wide. The shoulders were twice the width of any linebacker I've ever seen, and the arms hung lower than a human's would, swinging slightly as it walked. The whole body was covered in dark brown hair, almost black in some places, and matted in others. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders, with hardly any neck visible. I remember thinking, maybe it's a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. But that thought vanished as quickly as it came. No human being is built like that, and no hunter moves with that kind of fluid, powerful stride through rough terrain. My fingers tightened around my rifle, but I never even considered raising it. Not because I was scared, though I absolutely was, but because there was nothing threatening in the way it moved. It was just passing through, like it had somewhere to be and was taking the most direct route. As it crossed below me, I could make out more details. The hair on its back seemed longer than on its limbs. Its hands, if you could call them that, were large, with what looked like dark skin on the palms. And the way it moved was so deliberate, so sure-footed. It navigated over fallen logs and through brush with the ease of something that had spent its entire life in these forests. Then the smell hit me. It's hard to describe, but imagine a combination of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky and animal-like. Not the stench of death or decay, but a living smell, powerful and primal. It wasn't just in my nose. I could almost taste it at the back of my throat. I realized I'd been holding my breath, and when I finally inhaled, a small, involuntary sound escaped me. Not quite a gasp, but enough. The creature stopped. It didn't turn around fully, but its head rotated slightly, and I swear it was sensing the air, trying to locate me. I've never felt so exposed yet hidden at the same time. I was downwind, partially concealed by the tree and the curve of the trail, but I felt like it knew I was there. I didn't move a muscle, didn't blink, barely breathed. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, it continued walking. 3 more strides, and it disappeared into the tree line on the other side of the clearing, just gone. Something that big shouldn't be able to vanish so completely, so quickly, but it did. I stayed frozen in place for at least 10 minutes listening. The forest remained eerily quiet. No rustling, no breaking branches, nothing to indicate which way it had gone or if it was coming back. My legs were cramping from staying crouched for so long, but I didn't dare move until I was absolutely certain it was gone. When I finally stood up, my knees were shaking so badly I had to lean against the tree for support. My mouth was bone dry, and despite the cool air, I was drenched in sweat. I looked at my watch. Only 20 minutes had passed since I'd first rounded that bend in the trail, though it felt like hours. I debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to follow it, to see where it went, to confirm what I'd seen was real, but a more primal part of my brain, the part that recognizes when you're in the presence of something far up the food chain from you, told me to get the hell out of there. I listened to that voice and backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where it had disappeared. I didn't turn around until I was a good 100 yards back up the trail. Then I walked, not running but moving with purpose, straight back to camp. Mark was already there when I arrived, stoking the fire for dinner. One look at my face and he set down his stick. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I dropped onto the log we were using as a bench and tried to steady my breathing enough to speak clearly. Then I told him everything. Exactly what I'd seen, how it moved, the smell, all of it. I expected him to laugh or tell me I'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs or maybe a moose in bad light. But he didn't. He just listened, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more serious. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire. "You know," he finally said, "you're not the first person to see something like that around here. Guy I work with, his brother was logging up near Spirit Lake back in '89. Said his whole crew spotted something similar, moving through the trees. They all quit the next day, refused to go back to that site." We sat in silence for a while after that, the implications hanging in the air between us. Neither of us said the word. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, but we both knew what I'd seen. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound outside our tent had me wide awake, clutching my flashlight. The wind in the trees, an owl calling, even Mark snoring, everything seemed amplified and threatening. I kept seeing those powerful shoulders, that strange head with no neck, the way it just disappeared into the forest. At first light, we packed up camp without discussion. We'd planned to stay 4 more days, but neither of us suggested sticking to that plan. The whole time we were breaking down the tent and loading the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. The forest that had always felt like a second home to me now seemed alien and unwelcoming. I've been back to those woods hundreds of times since then. I still hunt, still fish, still hike, but I've never gone out alone again, and I always carry a bigger gun than I need. I've never seen anything like that creature again, but I know it's out there. Sometimes, especially in the fall when the mist settles among the trees, I catch that distinctive smell on the breeze, and my heart starts racing all over again. People can believe me or not, doesn't change what I saw that day. All I know is that there are things in these forests that don't appear in any wildlife guide. Things that have been here long before us and will likely outlast us. And they're watching us, even when we don't see them. Story 13. It was mid-October 2008. I'd been hiking the White Mountains regularly for about 5 years by then. I was 32, in decent shape, and considered myself pretty experienced. This particular Saturday, I'd chosen a moderately difficult trail I'd done a few times before. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the high 50s, and the fall foliage was peaking. Classic New Hampshire autumn. I got an early start, hitting the trailhead around 8 in the morning. The hike-up was uneventful, challenging in spots, but nothing I couldn't handle. I reached the ridge around 1 in the afternoon, ate my lunch, took some photos of the incredible view with the fall colors spreading across the valleys. Everything was completely normal. I started my descent around 3, giving myself plenty of time to get back before sunset. That's when things went sideways. About an hour into my descent, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I backtracked a bit, thinking I'd missed a turn, but couldn't find where I'd gone wrong. I checked my map and compass, tried to orient myself, but somehow I'd wandered off the main trail onto what might have been a game path or just a natural break in the underbrush. I wasn't immediately worried. I had water, some extra food, a first aid kit, and a headlamp in my pack, standard stuff, but I definitely wanted to get back to my car before dark. So I tried to navigate using the position of the sun and my compass to head in what I thought was the right general direction. By 5 o'clock, I knew I was in trouble. The forest had become denser, unfamiliar. The trees were older, closer together. I was definitely not on any marked trail anymore. My phone had no service, not unusual in those mountains. The sun was getting low, and that's when I first noticed the silence. If you spend any time in the woods, you know they're never really quiet. There's always something, birds, insects, leaves rustling, distant streams, but suddenly everything just stopped. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was so abrupt that I actually froze mid-step, thinking maybe I'd gone deaf. I remember popping my ears. That's how disorienting it was. Then I heard it, a deep huffing exhale, not like a deer snort or a bear huff. This was bigger, deeper. It reminded me of how a horse breathes after running, but magnified, and it came from nearby, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. I slowly turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. Even writing this now, my hands are shaking. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by trees but unmistakably there, stood something I still can't fully process. At first, my brain tried to make it a bear standing on its hind legs, but no. This was upright, naturally bipedal, and impossibly tall. Its head was brushing branches that had to be at least 8 feet off the ground, maybe taller. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, more like a shaggy coat that hung heavy on its frame. Its shoulders were massive, wider than any doorframe I've ever seen, and its arms hung long at its sides, the hands, I don't know what else to call them, reaching almost to its knees. Even in the fading light, I could make out facial features. That's what haunts me the most. Not just a vague head shape, but actual features. A pronounced sloped brow ridge, deep-set eye sockets, a broad, flat nose, and a wide mouth. It wasn't a mask or a costume. This was a face, alive, alert, and looking right at me. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then it took a step forward, and I swear I felt the ground tremble slightly. That broke my paralysis. I ran. I didn't think about which direction, didn't care about getting lost further, didn't worry about twisting an ankle or running into a tree. Pure survival instinct took over, and I just ran as fast as I could through the forest. I don't know how long I ran, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. My lungs were burning, branches were whipping at my face. I stumbled multiple times, but somehow kept upright. Eventually, I broke through into a small clearing with a cluster of large rocks in the center, the kind of glacial erratics you find all over New England. I scrambled up onto them, partly because they offered some height, and partly because I was simply exhausted and couldn't run anymore. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. That's when I realized I could hear it again, that deep, powerful breathing. I turned slowly and saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, about 30 yards away, half hidden among the trees, but watching me. Even at that distance, I could see its chest moving with each breath. The sound filled the space between us, in, out, not rushed or aggressive, just powerful, deliberate. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time stretched in a way I can't explain. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. It didn't approach further, just stood there watching. I was too terrified to move, to make a sound, to do anything but stare back. Then something changed in its posture. It shifted its weight, looked briefly to its left, then back at me. After one more long stare, it turned and moved back into the forest. Not hurrying, not crashing through the underbrush, but with a fluid, silent motion. that seemed impossible for something so large. I stayed frozen on those rocks, straining to hear any sound of its movement, but there was nothing. After it left, the silence lingered for maybe another 15 minutes. Then, gradually, I began to hear insects again, then a distant bird call. The forest was coming back to life around me. By then, it was almost completely dark. I knew I should try to find my way back, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the relative safety of those rocks until full darkness had fallen. I finally turned on my headlamp and, using my compass, began carefully making my way in what I hoped was the direction of the trailhead. By some miracle, and I don't use that word lightly, I stumbled across a marked trail around 10 o'clock that night. It wasn't the one I'd started on, but it was on my map, and I was able to follow it back to a road, then walk along the road for about 2 miles until I reached my car. The whole time, every rustle in the woods, every snap of a twig had me jumping out of my skin. But I never saw or heard the creature again that night. When I finally reached my car, I noticed something I hadn't before, a smell clinging to my clothes. It wasn't my own sweat or fear. Though there was plenty of that, this was different, a pungent mix of damp earth, rotting vegetation, and yes, feces. It was so strong that I stripped off my outer layers before getting into my car, stuffing them into a garbage bag I kept in my trunk. Even after washing those clothes 3 times, I eventually threw them away. The smell wouldn't completely leave, and every time I caught a whiff of it, the image of that creature would flash in my mind. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for years. Who would believe me? I convinced myself it was a bear, or extreme stress causing hallucinations, or anything else that would let me sleep at night. But I know what I saw. And as time has passed, I've become more, not less, certain of what I encountered. I've read about other encounters since then. I've learned the terminology, seen the documentaries, even joined some online groups. I still hike, but never alone and never in that part of the White Mountains. Some people collect these stories like badges of honor, but there was nothing honorable about the fear I felt that day. It was primal, overwhelming, and it fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. The thing that stays with me most isn't the size, though that was shocking. It's not even the face, though I see it in my dreams sometimes. It's the intelligence I sensed behind those eyes. This wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct. There was an assessment happening, a decision being made. Why it chose to leave me alone, I'll never know. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through those ancient forests. I wonder if it remembers our encounter the way I do. I wonder if others have seen it and, like me, kept quiet out of fear of ridicule. All I know for certain is what I experienced that October day. The deep, huffing breath, the massive, upright figure, the face that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I catch a hint of that smell again, and my blood runs cold. Story 14. I still can't believe what happened to me that day, and it's been 17 years. I've never told many people about this, but I need to get it off my chest because it still haunts me. It was July 2006, right after my 20th birthday. I'd been feeling restless that summer, working a crappy retail job and living with my parents to save money for college. Northern California was experiencing a heat wave, and I desperately needed to escape the inland temperatures. I'd heard about this secluded beach from a guy at work. He mentioned it was hard to get to, but worth it because nobody ever went there. "You'll have the whole place to yourself," he said. That sounded perfect to me. I just wanted some peace and quiet, away from the crowded tourist beaches. I drove out early that morning along Highway 1, following his vague directions. The fog was still hanging over the coastline when I parked at this unmarked pullout. There was no real parking area, just a widened shoulder where you could fit maybe 2 cars. Mine was the only one there. Finding the trailhead took me about 15 minutes of searching through thick brush. It wasn't maintained at all, just a narrow path that looked like it had been created by animals or maybe the occasional hiker. I had to push through scratchy bushes that left little cuts on my arms. The trail zigzagged down the cliff face, really steep in some parts, where I had to use roots and rocks to steady myself. When I finally reached the bottom, I had to pick my way over a jumble of slippery rocks. The whole journey down took maybe 25 minutes, but it felt longer because I had to be so careful. One wrong step, and I'd have twisted an ankle with no one around to help. The beach itself was incredible, though. It was like a hidden pocket, maybe 50 yards across, bordered by steep cliffs on one side and these massive rock formations jutting out into the ocean on the other side. The water was that deep, cold Pacific blue. By then, the fog had burned off and the sun was getting stronger. I set up my towel near the middle of the beach. I didn't bring much, just a small backpack with water, a sandwich and sunscreen. The isolation was exactly what I'd been craving. No people, no cell reception, no responsibilities, just the sound of waves crashing and seagulls circling overhead. I waded into the water first. It was freezing cold, but I'd grown up swimming in Northern California beaches, so I was used to it. I didn't go in too deep. The undertow can be dangerous on these secluded beaches, and there obviously wasn't any lifeguard. Just swam enough to cool off, then came back to my towel to dry in the sun. I remember eating half my sandwich and then lying back on my towel, putting my baseball cap over my face to block the sun. The sound of the waves was so rhythmic and soothing that I dozed off without meaning to. I'm not sure how long I was asleep, maybe 30 minutes or an hour. What woke me wasn't a sound exactly. It was more like that feeling you get when someone's watching you. You know that sensation where the hairs on your neck stand up? That's what jolted me awake. When I pushed my cap up and blinked against the bright sunlight, at first I didn't see anything unusual. Then my eyes focused on the area where the beach met the rocky outcropping, the side I had climbed down from. There was something standing on top of one of the larger rocks, something big. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it another hiker? Maybe someone wearing a bulky jacket? But as I stared, I realized it was way too tall to be a normal person, and the proportions were all wrong. This thing was standing perfectly still, just watching me. I sat up slowly, my heart starting to pound in my chest. It was huge, taller than any person I've ever seen, with these impossibly wide shoulders. Its arms hung down at its sides, and they looked too long for its body. The entire silhouette was dark against the lighter-colored rocks behind it, like it was covered in something dark. I remember thinking, this isn't happening, I'm still asleep. But the cold sweat breaking out all over my body told me I was wide awake. Neither of us moved for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Me sitting frozen on my towel, and this creature standing on the rocks, completely blocking my only path back up to the road. I couldn't run past it. I couldn't climb the sheer cliffs. I was trapped. Then the smell hit me. The wind must have shifted, because suddenly the air was filled with this powerful stench. It's hard to describe exactly, like rotting seaweed mixed with wet fur and something else, musky and animal-like. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I'd smelled dead seals on beaches before, but this was different. This smell was coming from something alive. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't outrun whatever this was. I couldn't fight it. My phone had no signal, even if I could reach it in my backpack without making sudden movements. I decided to try moving toward the water, thinking maybe I could wade along the shoreline to another part of the beach where I might find another way up. Very slowly, I started to gather my things, never taking my eyes off the figure. It was still just watching me, completely motionless, except for what looked like its chest rising and falling with breath. When I stood up, the creature shifted its position. It stepped down from the rock it had been standing on, and that's when I saw its full height. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, probably more. and I could now see that its entire body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, not like a coat or clothing, but like it was part of its skin. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I've never felt fear like that before. This primal, gut-level terror that makes your whole body feel ice-cold despite the warm sun. I was trying desperately not to make any sudden movements that might provoke it. I took one step toward the water, then another. The creature's head turned, following my movement. I still couldn't make out its face clearly. It was partly shadowed by the rocks behind it, and honestly, I didn't want to see it more clearly. I just knew it was watching me. Then something happened that gave me my chance. A seagull screeched loudly overhead, and for just a second, the creature looked up. In that moment, I dropped everything and plunged into the water. I didn't think about the cold or the currents or anything else. I just needed to get away. I pushed through the surf, moving parallel to the shore as fast as I could. The water was only waist deep where I was, but the uneven, rocky bottom made it hard to move quickly. Every few seconds I'd glance back, terrified that I'd see it coming after me, but it stayed where it was, just turning to keep watching me. I kept moving sideways along the shoreline, fighting against the push and pull of the waves. My legs were getting scraped on underwater rocks, but I barely felt it. After what seemed like forever, I managed to round the rocky outcropping that formed one end of the beach. To my relief, there was another stretch of sand beyond it, smaller and narrower, but it had a visible trail leading up the cliff face. It looked steeper and more dangerous than the one I'd come down, but I didn't care. I would have climbed straight up a vertical wall if it meant getting away. Before starting the climb, I looked back one last time. The creature was still standing there at the edge of the original beach, just watching me. Even from that distance, I could feel its eyes on me. It hadn't followed me into the water or around the rocks. It was just watching. I scrambled up that trail faster than I've ever climbed anything in my life. My hands were bleeding from grabbing onto sharp rocks and thorny plants, but adrenaline kept me moving. The trail was barely there, more like a game path, and twice I nearly fell when loose dirt gave way under my feet. But I kept going, using roots and rocks to pull myself up. When I finally reached the top, I was gasping for breath and covered in sweat, dirt and blood from countless small cuts. I emerged on a different part of the highway, maybe a quarter mile from where I'd parked. I ran along the road shoulder, constantly looking over my edge toward the cliff edge, terrified that whatever I'd seen would somehow appear on the road. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys with shaking hands, and locked myself inside. I sat there for several minutes just trying to breathe. My clothes were soaked. I'd left all my belongings on that beach, and I couldn't stop shivering despite the warm day. The drive home is a blur in my memory. I remember stopping at a gas station bathroom to rinse off the worst of the dirt and blood. The attendant asked if I was okay, and I mumbled something about falling while hiking. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what I'd actually seen. It's been 17 years, and I've never gone back to that beach. I've never even driven down that stretch of Highway 1 again. I've tried researching similar sightings in that area, and while there are some reports of strange encounters in the forests of Northern California, I haven't found anything exactly like what I experienced. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those eyes on me. I still remember that smell. That unmistakable, powerful odor that couldn't have come from any normal animal, and I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away, or if it had decided to follow me. I don't know what I saw that day. I've gone back and forth between thinking it was some undiscovered species, a person playing an elaborate prank, though how anyone could be that tall seems impossible, or something else entirely. What I do know is that I've never felt so small, so vulnerable, and so hunted as I did in those moments on that beach, with that enormous figure standing between me and safety. Story 15. I've kept this story mostly to myself for over 40 years now, only telling a handful of close friends who I knew wouldn't think I was crazy. But it's time to share it more widely, because it still bothers me, and maybe someone out there has had a similar experience and can help me make sense of what happened. Back in June of '83, my buddy and I planned a 3-day canoe trip in eastern Manitoba. We'd done plenty of wilderness trips before. We were experienced outdoorsmen who'd grown up hunting, fishing, and camping all over Manitoba's lakes and forests. This particular trip took us to Little Black Lake, which is pretty remote. Not the kind of place casual weekend warriors would visit. The first day went perfectly. Weather was great, fishing was decent, and we made good time on the water. By early evening, we'd reached a small island about 50 meters from the eastern shore that looked like an ideal camping spot. The lake was incredibly calm that evening, like glass, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. We pulled our canoe onto the rocky shore, set up our small tent, and started getting dinner ready. I remember checking my watch. It was around 7:30, still a couple hours before sunset in June that far north. My buddy was getting the portable stove going while I cleaned the fish we'd caught earlier. That's when I first heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, except there wasn't any wind. It sounded like a baby crying, but very distant. I shook it off. The wilderness plays tricks on your ears sometimes, and I didn't want to sound stupid by mentioning it. I kept cleaning fish, but the sound gradually got louder and definitely closer. After about 15 minutes, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was getting on my nerves, and I was starting to feel unsettled. "Hey," I finally asked, "do you hear something out there?" The look on my buddy's face told me everything before he even spoke. He looked relieved that I'd brought it up. "Thank God you hear it too," he said. "I thought I was losing it. Been hearing it for a while now." We both stopped what we were doing and just listened. The sound was coming from the eastern shore, the closest point to our island. It was still this weird crying sound, but now with these high-pitched growls mixed in. I've heard wolves, coyotes, bears, moose, every animal you can think of in the Manitoba wilderness, and this sounded like none of them. We stood there trying to rationalize it. Could be a wounded animal, maybe some kind of bird we weren't familiar with. But deep down, I knew it wasn't anything I'd encountered before. The sun was starting to set now and twilight was settling in. The sound had changed, less crying, more of this unsettling, whining growl. And now we could hear movement, twigs snapping, branches breaking. Whatever it was big enough to make serious noise moving through the brush. "What the hell is that?" my buddy whispered. I didn't answer because I had no idea. But I was getting increasingly uncomfortable. The creature, and I was now sure it was some kind of animal, was pacing back and forth along the shoreline, directly across from us. We could track its movement perfectly by sound. It would go about 30 yards in one direction, then turn and go back the other way. Back and forth, over and over. It was fully dark by 8:30 or 9, and we grabbed our flashlights. We pointed them toward the sounds, sweeping the beams across the shoreline. Several times, we saw trees swaying or branches moving, as if something large was brushing against them or knocking into them. But we never got a clear look at whatever was making the racket. My buddy had brought his .22 rifle along for protection, pretty standard for remote trips like this. After about an hour of this increasingly disturbing noise, with the growling getting louder and more agitated sounding, he decided enough was enough. "I'm going to fire a warning shot," he said, just to scare it off. I nodded, and he aimed the rifle upward, toward the treetops above where the sounds were coming from. The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the lake. Immediately, the creature went dead silent. For a few seconds, there was no sound at all. Then we heard it, unmistakably, running away from the shoreline into the forest. And I mean running. The sound of snapping branches and crashing undergrowth was intense. Whatever it was big, it was fast, and it was powerful enough to break substantial branches as it fled. We both stood there, flashlight still pointed toward the shore, hardly breathing. After the crashing sounds faded, the normal night sounds gradually returned. Frogs, insects, the occasional splash of a fish jumping. "What the hell was that?" my buddy asked again. And again, I had no answer. We didn't sleep much that night. We kept the fire going strong and took turns keeping watch. Nothing came back, but I kept replaying those sounds in my head. That crying noise that morphed into growling, the way it paced back and forth, as if studying us from the shore. The next morning, we packed up at first light and paddled over to the eastern shore. We beached the canoe and cautiously explored the area where the sounds had come from. The ground was covered in pine needles and moss, so we couldn't find clear tracks. We did find broken branches about 7 to 8 feet up on some of the trees, and a few saplings that had been snapped, not chewed, like a beaver would do, but broken by force. We didn't stick around. We cut our trip short and paddled back to our starting point that same day, arriving exhausted but relieved to be back in civilization. I've spent countless hours since then trying to figure out what we encountered. I've researched every animal native to Manitoba. Nothing matches what we heard. A wounded moose. No, the sounds were all wrong. Bear. Bears don't pace like that, and the vocalizations weren't right. Wolf or coyote. Not even close. I've even considered the possibility that it was another person trying to scare us, but that doesn't add up either. We were extremely remote, and why would someone trek all the way out there just to make weird noises at strangers? Plus, the power behind whatever was breaking those branches seemed beyond human capability. I've been reluctant to say this, but over the years I've come across stories about Sasquatch or Bigfoot encounters where people describe similar vocalizations. This weird mix of crying, whining, and growling. I'm not saying that's what we heard. I've always been skeptical about that sort of thing. But I can't explain what else it could have been. What bothers me most, even now, is the intelligence behind the behavior, the way it paced back and forth, almost like it was assessing us. The way it went silent when we fired the warning shot, as if it understood the potential danger. That doesn't seem like typical animal behavior to me. I've spent hundreds more nights in the wilderness since then. I've had close encounters with bears, been stalked by a mountain lion once on a trip out west, and had a massive bull moose walk right through our campsite in northern Ontario. None of those experiences bothered me the way that night at Little Black Lake did. Sometimes I still wake up at night thinking I hear that sound again, that high-pitched cry that turns into a growl. My wife says I talk in my sleep about it occasionally, even now, 4 decades later. I've never gone back to Little Black Lake. I don't think I ever will. Whatever was watching us from that shoreline that night was something I couldn't explain then, and still can't explain now. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it wanted us to know it was there. The wilderness is vast, and despite all our maps and GPS devices and knowledge, there are still things out there we don't understand. I'm not claiming I encountered something supernatural or a cryptid or anything like that. I'm just saying that after 40 years of turning it over in my mind, I still have no explanation for what we heard at Little Black Lake that night in '83. And that's what scares me the most. Story 16. I still get chills when I think about that night. It's been almost a decade, but the memory haunts me like it happened yesterday. Some things just stick with you, you know? This is one of those things I can't explain, and to be honest, I'm not sure I want an explanation. I moved to Eatonville, Washington back in the summer of 2014. It's a small town, really small, the kind where everyone knows everyone else's business by sundown. I'd taken a job at the local hardware store after leaving Seattle. City life had worn me down, and I was craving some peace and quiet. The apartment I found on Mashal Avenue South wasn't anything special, just a 1-bedroom unit in a small complex with about 8 other apartments. It was affordable, clean, and most importantly, surrounded by incredible scenery. Mount Rainier loomed in the background like a guardian, and dense forests spread out in every direction. Life was simple there. My daily routine consisted of work, occasional hikes on weekends, and quiet evenings at home. I didn't make many friends, just exchanged pleasantries with neighbors and co-workers. I'm naturally a bit of a loner, and Eatonville seemed perfect for that. I felt safe there, protected somehow. That changed on a cold night in late November. I remember it was a Tuesday. I'd worked a longer shift than usual because we were preparing for a Black Friday sale. My boss had me restocking shelves and arranging displays until well after closing time. By the time I left, it was already dark, which isn't saying much for Washington in November. Darkness falls early up there. I pulled into my parking spot around 8:15 that evening. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath forming clouds in front of my face as I got out of my car. The streetlights cast an orange glow across the parking lot, and the mountain was just a massive shadow against the night sky. Everything seemed normal, quiet, peaceful. I remember fumbling with my keys as I approached my front door. My fingers were numb from the cold, and I was thinking about the leftover pizza in my fridge. Such ordinary thoughts, such a normal moment, and then everything changed. Just as I was about to unlock my door, I heard it, a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was a hooting noise, rapid, repetitive, almost rhythmic, but not like an owl. Not like anything I'd ever heard before. It had this quality to it, hard to describe, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up instantly. I turned around, keys still in hand, and walked to the edge of my doorstep. The sound had come from behind me, from the direction of the mountain to the south of town. I stood there listening, wondering if I'd imagined it. Then it happened again. The same rapid hooting, but this time it ended with an extra note, harsher, almost like a warning, like something was trying to communicate across the valley. It echoed slightly, bouncing off the mountains and traveling through the crisp night air. The depth of that sound, I'll never forget it. It had to come from something with a massive chest cavity, something big, really big. But what made it truly unsettling was the high, screaming edge that accompanied the deeper tones. It was like two sounds layered together, a deep, powerful hooting and a piercing scream that cut through the night air like a knife. The moment that sound finished, every dog in Eatonville went absolutely berserk. I mean, every single one. It was like a wave of barking and howling that swept through the town. Dogs that normally never made a peep were suddenly going crazy. The noise was deafening, this chorus of terrified animals all responding at once. I stood frozen on my doorstep. My heart was racing, and I could feel adrenaline coursing through my veins. There's this primal part of your brain that recognizes danger even before your conscious mind can process it. That part was screaming at me to get inside, to lock the door, to hide. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed, listening, waiting. The barking continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of minutes. Gradually, the dogs began to quiet down. First one, then another, until the night was almost silent again. That silence felt heavy, expectant, like the whole town was holding its breath. I waited there, straining to hear anything else, any clue about what had made that sound. My apartment complex backed up against a wooded area that eventually led to denser forest and ultimately the mountain. I found myself staring into those trees, trying to penetrate the darkness between them. As the silence stretched on, I became aware of how exposed I was, standing there on my doorstep. The feeling of being watched washed over me. You know that sensation, when the back of your neck tingles and you just know someone's eyes are on you. It was overwhelming. I quickly unlocked my door, slipped inside, and locked it behind me. I didn't turn on any lights immediately. Instead, I moved to my window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. The parking lot was empty. Nothing moved in the tree line. Everything looked exactly as it had before, but it felt completely different. After a few minutes of watching, I finally turned on a lamp and tried to shake off the unease. I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Maybe it was some kind of unusual bird, or perhaps it was mechanical, some equipment on the mountain or in the forest. But deep down, I knew better. I'd grown up in Washington. I was familiar with the sounds of the local wildlife. This was something else entirely. I spent that night researching animal sounds on my laptop. I listened to recordings of owls, cougars, bears, anything that might make a sound remotely similar to what I'd heard. Nothing matched. The closest I came was when I stumbled across some vocalization clips from the Gorilla Foundation. That deep, chest-resonating quality was similar. But even those gorilla calls lacked the powerful, piercing scream that had overlaid the hooting I'd heard. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept getting up to check the windows and door. Every creak of the building, every distant sound had me on edge. When I did finally fall asleep, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures moving just beyond my line of sight. The next morning, I headed to work earlier than usual, partly because I couldn't stand being in my apartment anymore. On my way, I stopped at the local diner for coffee. It was busier than normal, with clusters of people huddled around tables, talking in low voices. I caught fragments of conversations, heard it all the way across town. Dogs were going crazy. Never heard anything like it in 30 years living here. I wasn't the only one who'd experienced it. That should have been reassuring, but somehow it made it worse. It validated my fear. This wasn't just in my head. I asked my co-worker, an older guy who'd lived in Eatonville his whole life, if he'd heard the sound. The look on his face told me everything before he even spoke. He nodded slowly, then looked around to make sure no one else was listening. My grandpa used to talk about those sounds, he said quietly, called them the mountain calls. Said they'd come down from Rainier every few decades, always at night, always followed by the dogs going wild. What makes them? I asked. He just shook his head. Grandpa would never say directly. Just warned us to stay inside when we heard them. Said some things in these forests are best left alone. That night, I went straight home after work and locked myself in. I didn't want to be outside if that sound came again. The next day was the same, and the next. My short walks from the car to my apartment became fast, nervous dashes. I started keeping the curtains drawn at all times. About a week after that first night, I was awakened at around 3 a.m. by the sound of something heavy moving around outside my bedroom window. My apartment was on the ground floor, and that window faced the woods. There was a scraping noise, like something large dragging against the building's siding. Then a deep, huffing breath. Not quite a sniff, but something similar. I lay perfectly still in my bed, hardly daring to breathe. Whatever was out there moved slowly along the length of my apartment, pausing occasionally. When it reached my living room window, I heard a soft tapping, like something was gently testing the glass. Then came a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. It wasn't aggressive exactly, more curious, investigating. I've never been so terrified in my life. I was certain that if I moved, if I made any noise at all, whatever was out there would know exactly where I was. The presence remained outside my apartment for maybe 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. Eventually, I heard heavy footsteps moving away, snapping twigs and rustling undergrowth as they retreated into the forest. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally came, I cautiously checked outside. The ground was too hard from the cold to show footprints, but I found tufts of dark, coarse hair caught on the rough siding of the building. They were unlike any animal hair I'd seen before, too thick for deer, too coarse for bear. I took one and examined it in the morning light. It was about 6 inches long, dark brown with lighter tips. I didn't tell anyone about this. Who would believe me? Instead, I started researching local legends and folklore. I found stories about mountain devils and forest giants in old settler accounts. Native American tales spoke of powerful beings that lived in the deep forests around Mount Rainier, beings that could mimic sounds and calls, that moved primarily at night, that commanded a certain respect from other animals. The hooting call never came again while I was in Eatonville, but twice more I heard something large moving around my apartment at night. Each time I remained frozen in fear until it left. Each time I found more of those strange hairs outside my windows or caught on nearby branches. I lasted only 7 months in Eatonville. By spring, I couldn't take the constant anxiety anymore. I broke my lease and moved back to Seattle, where the only sounds outside my window are traffic and people. To this day, I've never found an explanation for what I heard and experienced. I've shown those hairs to a friend who works in biology, but he couldn't identify them. Sometimes I think about going back, about trying to find answers. But then I remember the feeling of being watched, of something large and powerful moving just outside my walls, and I stay where I am. Whatever made that call across the valley that November night, whatever visited my apartment in the following weeks, I don't think it meant harm. But there was something ancient and wild in those sounds, something that doesn't belong in our world anymore, something that should remain hidden in the shadows of Mount Rainier, calling out only on the darkest nights when most of us are safely behind locked doors. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, certain I've heard that hooting call again. I never have, but I always check my locks anyway. Story 17. I've been debating whether to post this for months. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's been eating me up inside, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. This happened last summer. I'd just turned 33 and received some potentially devastating health news from my doctor. I won't go into details, but it was the kind of news that makes you question everything. I needed space to think, to process what was happening to my body. My wife was supportive, but I could tell she was more scared than I was, and I couldn't handle her fear on top of mine. So I decided to take a day trip into the mountains with my pit bull Luna. She's been my hiking buddy for years, protective but gentle, about 60 pounds of solid muscle and unwavering loyalty. I figured the fresh air would clear my head, give me some perspective. I drove up Highway 168 near Shaver Lake. It was a Tuesday morning in June, so the area wasn't crowded. I parked at this little pull-off I knew about and headed up an old logging road. The weather was perfect, not too hot yet, clear blue sky. I remember feeling a sense of relief just being away from everything. Cell service disappeared about 20 minutes into the hike, which was exactly what I wanted. We hiked for a couple hours, stopping occasionally for water breaks and to take in the views. Luna was having a blast, running ahead and then circling back to check on me. I was feeling better than I had in weeks, like maybe whatever was happening in my body wasn't the end of the world. Around midday, we reached this little clearing. I remember checking my watch. It was just after noon, and thinking we should probably turn back soon. That's when everything changed. Luna, who had been bouncing around sniffing everything, suddenly froze. The transformation was instant and unsettling. Her entire body went rigid. The hair on her neck and back stood straight up, and she fixed her gaze on a manzanita bush about 15 feet ahead of us. I'd seen her alert to deer and even a bear cub once, but this was different. She wasn't barking or growling. She was completely still, like she was terrified. My first thought was, bear. We get black bears in these mountains, and while they're usually not aggressive, a mother with cubs could be dangerous. So I did what I'd been taught. I called out loudly, "Hey, bear!" thinking it would startle whatever was there and send it running. What happened next still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. From behind the manzanita bush, something stood up. Not a bear, not a human, something else entirely. I could see it from the chest up. It was a female creature. I don't know what else to call it. She had strawberry blonde hair covering her body. Not fur exactly, but hair, like a human's, but all over. Her face was... God, it's hard to describe. It was like a cross between a human and something primitive. Her features were flatter than ours, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wider nose. But her eyes were the most human thing about her. They were an amber brown color. And they looked intelligent, aware. She just stood there staring at me. I stared back. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Luna pressed against my leg, trembling. The creature didn't make any aggressive moves, but she didn't look afraid either. She seemed curious. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute. The world had gone completely silent except for my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then Luna started whimpering, this high-pitched, terrified sound I'd never heard her make before. That's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling growl from my left. I turned my head slowly, afraid of what I might see. About 200 yards up the hill was another creature, much, much larger than the female. It was partially obscured by trees, but I could tell it was watching us. The male, and I immediately knew it was a male, was massive. Even at that distance, I could see how big it was compared to the trees around it. When the male saw me look at him, something changed. He started moving down the hill toward us, not running at first, but walking with purpose. Then he picked up speed. Each step seemed to cover an impossible amount of ground. Panic exploded in my chest. I couldn't outrun it, couldn't fight it. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my body wouldn't respond. Luna was pressed so hard against my leg, she was almost knocking me over. In a moment of desperate clarity, I grabbed Luna and pulled her close to my chest. I dropped to the ground and curled into a ball around her, protecting her with my body. I shut my eyes tight and waited for whatever was going to happen. I could feel the ground vibrating with each step as it approached. Thud, thud, thud. Each impact sent a jolt through my body. The sound of breaking branches and disturbed earth grew louder. Luna was shaking violently in my arms, but she'd gone completely silent. The footsteps stopped, so close I could hear breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing. I could smell it too. A wild, musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before, earthy and organic, but undeniably animal. I waited for pain, for the creature to attack, but nothing happened. After several agonizing seconds, I heard movement again, but moving away. Cautiously, I opened one eye. The male had backed up several yards and was now standing beside the female. Seeing them together was shocking. She was tall, probably over 6 feet, but she only reached the male's upper abdomen. He was enormous, with shoulders wider than any human I've ever seen, covered in the same strawberry blonde hair, but darker in places. His arms hung longer than human proportions, with massive hands. I stayed completely still, afraid any movement would provoke them. My mind raced through options. I had a pistol in my backpack. I always carry one for emergencies in the wilderness. Slowly, very slowly, I shifted my weight to reach for my pack. The male immediately let out a growl that I felt more than heard. A deep, reverberating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze again, my hand halfway to my backpack. Instead of going for the gun, I had another idea. Moving as slowly as possible, I reached into the side pocket of my pack, where I kept snacks. I pulled out an apple, a Honeycrisp I'd brought for lunch. With a shaking hand, I extended it in their direction, not standing up, just offering it from my crouched position. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the female took a step forward. The male made a sound, not quite a growl, something softer. She paused, then continued toward me. Every muscle in my body was screaming to run, but I remained still. She approached cautiously, then reached out and took the apple from my hand. Her fingers were like ours, but larger, with thick nails that weren't quite claws. Our fingers brushed for a split second, and her skin felt rough and calloused. She stepped back and ate the apple, core and all, in 3 bites. The male made another sound, a kind of chuffing noise, and the female turned toward him. Without another glance at me, they both turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees with surprising quickness and silence for creatures their size. I stayed frozen in place for at least 5 minutes after they left, too terrified to move. Luna eventually squirmed out of my grip and cautiously sniffed the area where they had been standing. When I finally stood up on shaking legs, I realized just how big they had been. The manzanita bush the female had been behind was taller than me. I'm 5'8", and it was at least 6 to 8 inches higher than my head, and the male had been substantially taller than that. The male was also wider than the bush, which was about 4 feet across. I noticed something else. Behind the bush where they had been, there was a small puddle of blood on the ground, about the size of my palm. Fresh blood. I didn't investigate further. Luna came back to me, still on edge, but no longer terrified. We left immediately, moving as quickly as I could, while constantly looking over my shoulder. The hike back to the car seemed to take 3 times longer than the hike in. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made my heart race. When we finally reached the car, I was drenched in sweat despite the mild temperature. I locked the doors as soon as we got in, even though it was a pointless gesture. Those creatures could have torn the car apart if they wanted to. I was so shaken that I could barely drive. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I had to pull over twice on the way home because I thought I was going to throw up. It took me 3 days before I could tell my wife what happened. At first, she thought I was making it up or had seen a bear and panicked. But she knows me well enough to recognize genuine terror, and she's never seen me as shaken as I was in those days after. Since then, I've refused to go into the woods alone. I won't hike after dark. I've cancelled our annual camping trip. Luna seems to have bounced back, but she gets anxious in heavily wooded areas now. The health scare that sent me to the mountains that day, it turned out to be a false alarm. The follow-up tests came back negative, but in a way, that experience in the woods put everything in perspective. There are things out there we don't understand, things that make our human problems seem small. I still don't know what I saw that day. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown primate. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that they exist, and they let me walk away. Sometimes I wonder if it was the female who saved me, if she convinced the male not to attack. Sometimes I wonder if they were as curious about me as I was terrified of them. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most days I have trouble believing it myself. But every night when I close my eyes, I see those intelligent amber eyes staring back at me, and I know what I saw was real. Story 18. I've been sitting on this for decades, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm not some attention seeker or someone who makes up stories for kicks. What happened that summer changed how I see the woods forever. It was summer of 1982, just a year after Mount St. Helens had that massive eruption. The whole area was still recovering. Ash everywhere, trees down, the landscape transformed. I was 15 at the time, hanging out with my friend, also 15, my cousin, 14, and my brother, 13. We were all at that age where we thought we were invincible, you know? That morning started like any other day at our family cabin. We'd been going there since I was 10, and I knew those woods like the back of my hand. The cabin belonged to my parents. Nothing fancy, just a rustic place where we could escape city life and enjoy nature. We'd hunted, fished, and hiked through those forests countless times. I'd even encountered a grizzly once, about 3 years earlier, and hadn't panicked, just backed away slowly and left it alone. No big deal. The woods never scared me. But this day was different from the moment we stepped into the tree line. We were just carrying BB guns, nothing serious. Just boys being boys, pretending we were big game hunters or whatever. We'd planned to spend the day exploring, maybe shoot at some cans, typical teenage stuff. The weather was decent that morning, warm but not too hot, slightly overcast. The instant we stepped into those woods, something felt wrong. I can't explain it any better than this. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. There was no reason for it. No strange noises, no unusual sights. Nothing I could point to and say, that's what made me feel uneasy. It was just this overwhelming sensation of being watched. I remember looking at the others to see if they felt it too. My friend kept glancing around nervously. My brother was sticking closer to me than usual. My cousin kept asking if we'd heard something. None of us said what we were thinking, but I know now we all felt it. Still, we pushed forward. We were teenagers. Admitting we were scared wasn't an option, so we hiked deeper into the woods, following a trail we'd taken dozens of times before. The feeling grew stronger with each step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there. About 2 hours in, the sky darkened as a thunderstorm rolled in. The wind picked up, and the trees started swaying. We decided to head back to the cabin, not because we were scared, though we were, but because getting caught in a storm in those woods wasn't smart. As we turned back, that's when the sensation changed from being watched to being followed. Something was tracking us, I'm certain of it. What bothered me most was the silence. Whatever was following us made absolutely no sound. No twigs snapping, no leaves rustling. In woods like those, everything makes noise when it moves. Even experienced hunters, even animals that have evolved to be stealthy. But this was different. We picked up our pace without discussing why. Nobody wanted to be the one to admit they were freaked out. About halfway back to the edge of the forest, we heard something up ahead. We all froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't rain starting to fall. It was heavy movement, deliberate. And then silence again. After a few moments of standing perfectly still, we started moving again, faster this time. No one spoke. We just wanted out of those woods. When we finally broke through the tree line about 400 yards from the cabin, I felt such relief. But something made me turn back and look. That's when I saw it. Standing right at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. It was black, tall, maybe 6 feet or so, and it was just watching us. It stood perfectly still about 200 yards away. We couldn't tell if it was a bear standing on its hind legs or something else. After a few seconds, it stepped backward and disappeared into the trees. We ran the rest of the way to the cabin and didn't talk about what we'd seen. I think we were all trying to convince ourselves it was just a bear. Bears are normal. Bears make sense. Whatever feeling had haunted us in those woods, that didn't make sense. 2 days later, the sun was shining and our teenage bravado had returned. We convinced ourselves we'd overreacted because of the approaching storm. My friend suggested we go back into the woods, and not wanting to seem like cowards, we agreed. This time, though, we went in the middle of the day when it was bright and sunny. We followed the same trail as before. I was trying to act tough, but my senses were on high alert. About 300 yards in, my brother pointed to something on the ground. In a patch of mud near a small stream was a footprint. Not just any footprint. This thing was massive. It was shaped like a human foot, but much, much larger. I wear a size 12 shoe, and this print was easily 6 inches longer and wider than mine. What really got to me was that it had toes, 5 distinct toes, like a human's, not the rounded pad with claws that you'd see from a bear. The impression was deep, which meant whatever made it was heavy. We all stared at it, not saying a word. That's when the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Without discussing it, we decided to leave. But instead of following the same path back through the woods, we cut across an open field that ran parallel to the tree line. We figured staying in the open was safer. We'd made it about halfway across the field when my friend suddenly stopped walking. His arm shot out, pointing toward the woods, and when I looked at his face, it had gone completely pale. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. Sitting on an old fallen tree stump, just about 5 yards into the forest, was what I can only describe as a Bigfoot. We were maybe 50 yards away from it, close enough that I could see it clearly in the midday sun. It was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, even while sitting, covered in dark, matted fur. But what I remember most vividly was its face. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its features were flatter, more ape-like, but with intelligent eyes that were fixed directly on us. As we stood frozen in shock, it turned its entire upper torso, as if it had no neck, to look in another direction. The movement was so strange, so unnatural, then it slowly turned back toward us, those eyes locking onto ours again. That broke our trance. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't look back, didn't stop to catch my breath, didn't think about anything except getting as far away from that creature as possible. When we reached the cabin, we were all hyperventilating, tripping over our words as we tried to explain to my parents what we'd seen. My mom thought we were making it up. My dad looked concerned but skeptical. My friend called his father, who arrived about an hour later with a pistol. My dad grabbed his hunting rifle and we all went back, the 4 of us kids plus the 2 adults. The whole way there I was terrified, but also determined to prove we weren't lying. We showed them the footprint, which they examined carefully. My friend's dad took pictures of it, which, unfortunately, didn't develop well. This was before digital cameras. We then cautiously approached the fallen tree where we'd seen the creature, but it was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. As we were heading back, something unexpected happened. My mom, who had stayed behind at the cabin, came running toward us, waving her arms frantically. When she reached us, she was out of breath and visibly shaken. "It's behind you," she gasped. I saw it from the cabin window, following along the tree line. I spun around, my dad's rifle ready in my hands, heart pounding in my chest. Just for a second, I caught a glimpse of something large with dark fur disappearing into the dense woods. Just the back of it, moving with surprising speed for something so big. My dad contacted the local game warden, who came out the next day to investigate. He searched the area thoroughly but couldn't find the footprint. It had rained overnight. He did, however, find a bush that had been completely flattened, as if something very heavy had been lying there. And he noticed something else. A smell, a terrible pungent odor that hung in the air around that spot. He described it as a mix of strong body odor, urine, and feces. Said he'd never smelled anything quite like it in all his years in the woods. That smell is something many Bigfoot witnesses report. I later learned when I started researching after our encounter. I've gone back to those woods many times in the years since. I'm a police officer now, and I've faced some scary situations in my career. But nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever frightened me as much as that moment when the creature turned to look at us. I always bring a rifle with me when I return to those woods, but the truth is, I don't think I'd ever shoot this creature if I saw it again. Whatever it was, it had plenty of opportunities to hurt us if that's what it wanted. It was following us that first day. It was watching us. It could have attacked at any time, but it didn't. It just observed. That makes me think, these creatures, if they really are Bigfoot, aren't the monsters some people make them out to be. I don't talk about this experience much. Most people don't believe in Bigfoot, and I understand their skepticism. Before that summer, I wouldn't have believed it either, but I know what I saw. I know what my brother, my cousin, and my friends saw. I know what my mother saw, and I know that something was out there in those woods, something that science says doesn't exist. To this day, I still get that feeling sometimes when I'm in the forest, that sensation of being watched. When it happens, I don't run anymore. I just acknowledge its presence and move on. Those woods are its home, after all. I'm just a visitor.